Hey, Bruno.
So good morning, everyone who's joining us. We have some participants already online. Those who are on YouTube, on Zoom, and here in the room, a warm welcome to everyone. Today we're going to have this cozy, very warm. It looks like small, but actually you're in a broader, with a broader audience, to keep going on our discussion, our debates on what development banks do and what should we do to do better. So that's our purpose always. Also today, when you're gonna have three panels on last mile banks or what's being done in the ground from these smaller institutions and how the larger ones are building these partnerships to make deliveries in the last mile. We're gonna also have a debate on climate change. So we have four institutions joining us to tell what are the challenges and what are the good stories that are going on right now about finance, climate change, how they interact with technology and infrastructure finance. We are also having a third panel on social impact. So we'll be discussing especially gender and small businesses. And I think we're all very happy to follow up what we've had yesterday, because we had this brilliant Naira's moderation. I'm not going to be as brilliant. So I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I'm going to do my best. But I think yesterday, just to wrap up and bring yesterday's conversation into today's morning, yesterday we have these brilliant talks from Leslie and Vivienne and Reina, telling the stories of these multilateral banks in Latin America, global outreach, Africa, and some flaws in the system to build forward and do more. We have had some highlights like regulation convergence to unlock climate change investments, funding costs, and how rating has been a hurdle to finance in Africa, for instance. That was one great point that Vivienne brought us. Funding costs, cooperation in platforms and partnerships to issue bonds that leverage investments. That was great contribution from Reina. Solutions as blended finance and local currency loans, that was brought, and Leslie did a great talk also about that. And governance is a key feature to curb classical problems from development banks, and curbs problems such as political influence. And also we have discussed a little bit how macroeconomic and political volatility also can hurt businesses, but how international partnerships have been so important to help last mile banks to overcome this challenge. So today, with no more, we are gonna debate on the first panel on last mile banks, and we have today in the session Claudia, who is joining us from Paris. Claudia, is that all right? Is that right? Are you in Paris or any other part of the world? Are you listening to us, Claudia? I don't think he is. Carlos?
Yes. I was waiting for my turn, but Claudio, I was like, who's Claudio?
So we are having Carlos joining us. Carlos is co-director of the Global Fund for Development of Cities, FMDV, and has been working for more than 20 years on sustainable development. He's an awarded journalist, but has also been working supporting financial institutions. Since March 2021, he's been coordinating the Morocco National Support Program for Subnational Climate Action called SIDBI. Is it SIDBI? Okay, I was going to spell it out, but I think it's good like that. That's implementing together with the Moroccan Ministry of International Affairs and 2 national associations of mayors and governors. He's been a strategic and financial expertise hub. So that's really brilliant. And he's going to talk a little bit about what he's been seeing from his perspective at FMDV. What are the big challenges in the last mile? We also have in Boitumelo, Mosako. Thank you, Boitumelo, for being here, joining us. Boitumelo is the CFO of the South African Development Bank of South Africa, DB. I always do it wrong. Sorry, Boitumelo. Talking a little bit also about her partnerships, and we're going to have a last minute join. That's Bruno. Thank you, Bruno. Bruno Laskowsky from the National Development Bank in Brazil. We're very sorry, but Susan Lund had a board meeting today, a last minute board meeting, and she cannot join us. So we're going to have a Brazilian experience rather than an IFC experience, right? So going to the first point of, and bringing from yesterday's debate, how have Boitumelo, your institution, been working with partnerships? If you can just give a helicopter about DBSA and how you work, what are your items, what do you finance, but at the same time, how are you partnering with different institutions to finance?
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to be here, Aline, and good morning to everyone who's here and online as well. DBSA Development Bank of Southern, even though it says Southern Africa, is a wholly owned development finance institution by the South African government with a geographical footprint across sub-Saharan Africa. We are mainly an infrastructure bank, and we focus on key sectors in that space, and that's namely water, digital infrastructure, energy, transport, health, education, and human settlement as well. So those are our main key sectors. And you would say we're not a traditional development finance institution in that we play along the full infrastructure value chain. What do I mean by that? What we do is we do planning. So we actually help our municipalities. I think you guys call them subnational governments. So we help our municipalities, especially the under-resourced ones. So the ones that you find in the rural areas, we help those to actually plan, and we, to do the infrastructure planning, the bulk infrastructure planning, whatever infrastructure assessments, we then do those for them. What does that do? That then has the opportunity to unlock infrastructure, in that when we provide that technical support to the municipalities, then they're well positioned to put together their plans so that they can put their business case forward to get fiscal allocations for the various infrastructure projects. And the benefit in that regard is that then it actually ensures that there's economic activities in those municipalities. People live in dignity, and most importantly, there's a possibility of creating economic nodes out of those under-resourced municipalities. We also help them with revenue and enhancement program and asset care as well. Then we prepare. That's the next level. So we do project preparation, and that is something that is quite common, amongst most development finance institution. And this is a critical role that we play, and we categorize that it's playing a catalytic role. because we know that, and going back to your question around partnership, we can't do it alone, right? So it's then about what is it that we leverage, to actually, ensure that we do more from a delivery perspective. So on the project preparation side, we then de-risk projects to get them to a bankability, so that in that way we can then crowd private sector finance. Now, what I want to add there, Lynn, is that we don't only use DBSA resources in the space, in terms of our own balance sheet. We also implement on behalf of our partners. We have other development finance, European development finance institutions who then make, grant allocations that we actually, implement programs on their behalf as well. And we are also currently doing project preparation on behalf of the South African government to support the infrastructure fund, and I'll touch a little bit more on that at a later stage. So that's then what we do in the project preparation stage. Then we get to finance. That is, where,
and everybody, you smile because that's the part that you like.
That's where then, everybody plays a role, where you do your loans, and we also have an equity portfolio in this space as well. And what is also a differentiator is in the build space. So what we do is we actually implement infrastructure on behalf of state-owned entities or even our national governments, and this is to augment state capacity. So we have an infrastructure delivery division that actually goes through a procurement process and actually gets construction. It actually constructs schools, roads, health facilities on behalf of the on behalf of the state. So that's what we offer there, and we also do maintenance, on behalf of, for instance, our Department of Public Works. So as a development finance institution, we play that role along the value chain. Now that's what we do as DBSA. Now post COVID, and our president, announced 2 years ago that we are now at a stage of an infrastructure-led economic recovery, and DBSA is really at the heart of it. So one of the things that we have done as an institution, and this goes back, and I always say this goes back to partnerships, is we have then partnered with our National Treasury and our Department of Public Works to then form the infrastructure fund. And the infrastructure fund is actually a blended finance platform that DBSA and the National Treasury equally fund. So we fund 50-50 the operations of this infrastructure fund, and it's currently being incubated within DBSA. And the main aim behind the infrastructure fund is to it's a blended finance platform, as I said, is to actually accelerate infrastructure development by adopting a programmatic approach. So one of these is we don't look at projects on a, let's say 1-by-1 basis, but then say, how do we have a programmatic approach to then say, this is a program we're doing, for instance, in student housing. This is a program we are doing to improve technical infrastructure through, implementing connectivity infrastructure. So that's how we are, then approaching projects through the infrastructure fund, where we then leverage fiscal money to then catalyze private funds and actually, develop structures, because remember, private money comes with the revenue assurance. There must be a revenue flow. So we then are going to create. We then create those structures for private sector participation, so that we can achieve the more than $1 trillion, not $1 trillion, trillion rand infrastructure program that we're planning to then roll out over the next 10 years. So that's one of the things that we are doing.
That's great, Boitumelo. I'm gonna just hold you there, because what you say is very interesting. And you're saying what you do, you work on preparation, given technical support, and you support the municipalities and on building their projects. You then have credit phase, but you also do more than that. You implement projects. You are doers. It's a bit different of some other models where you're acting more of a credit and guarantees and investing on equities. It's more the financial side of it. You're more also what in some countries is what governments do, the direct public administration do. So you're also doing that work, which is very interesting, because Chinese Development Bank does, they apply the same kind of rule, and you were also doing blended finance to crowding resources. So I'm going to move to Bruno, and because you were back in Southern Africa, working on development infrastructure, and the National Development Bank in Brazil. You also have missions that converge, but different ways of operating. So I'll just pass you the word, so you can 5 minutes tell us what is it that you do that is matches or unmatches what has been done in Africa so far.
Okay, first of all, good morning, all. Good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to be here. Thanks, Lenny, for the opportunity and the invitation. Let me step back just to tell you a story. We took over the bank about 3 years ago. I've never in my life worked in the public sector. Traditionally, all my career was done in the private sector, banking, from running companies, being a turnarounder. So when I received the invitation to join the bank, I had a mission. BNDES, at that time, about 3 years ago, we have a portfolio. I run the equity investments of the bank and the distressed portfolio, and I got the opportunity to run also the SME strategy. That's exactly what you mentioned. But back 2 years ago, we had the public equity portfolio of 125 billion BRL, which is roughly $25 billion, something like that. And the net worth of the bank around 90 billion BRL, which is $15 billion. So BNDES at that time was a hedging fund, was not a development bank. So what was the mission? Starting a major divestment program. So we divest around 90 billion of public equity. And then we shaped this as a major capital recycling strategy. And what we have done since then, well, we have been divesting, and we decided to form and to allocate some portfolios. Infrastructure for sure, but infrastructure more on the project finance, non-recourse side. Innovation, technology through venture capital, massively, hugely on venture capital. Everything related to private debt. And this, the way I met Lenny dealing with this thing. And the fourth block is everything related to environmental assets, which will be the next panel. Well, when we have decided to increase, to enlarge, to reinforce our strategy on private debt, happens at the same time to have the COVID. So the COVID, the black swan, somehow ignite and make the strategy broader and with much more energy. Let me explain the way we dealt with this thing. BNDES is a neutral model in the sense that we don't have branches, don't have any objective to be close to the individuals. But on the other hand, we are a major provider of credit lines and funding for the subnationals. But we do believe at that time this is very limited the way we can be more active on fostering private debt. So what we have done, we spend largely our distribution base. So built on technology and digital. So right now, our credit outstanding, the credit inventory of BNDES in the MSME is something like 100 billion BRL, which is $20 billion. Plus, because of the COVID, we did a sort of analysis. What's missing in our portfolio? And the key element of this gap was guarantee funds. So together with the National Treasury, we defined a strategy to recreate, to grow guaranteed funds on the umbrella of BNDES. So we got 20 billion BRL from the government, and with this 20 billion BRL, we transform into the economy around 100 billion BRL because of the leverage, because of stop losses, et cetera, et cetera. And this strategy, we have a sort of a portfolio today of 200 billion BRL, which is 40 to 50 billion dollars. And this is amazing. And when we have done this, we decided to expand our distribution base. And this from the angle of BNDES. When we did it, today we work with more than 60 distributors from the big banks, smaller banks, cooperative banks, subnationals, microcredit operators, fintechs, and a special classification in Brazil that the central bank does for some fintechs, more prepared fintechs, more robust fintechs like SIDBs, Sociedade de Crédito. And with this platform, we started to have a family of new guarantee funds. Now we have a guarantee fund with SIDBI. And Boitumelo, as you said, we believe that this is. I'm gonna finish with it. And the question you have to answer yesterday: what's the difference between the private and the public? Blah blah blah. Even though BNDES is a bank, it's not a bank. It's a development bank. So the KPIs, the way you have to guide your performance, it's not necessarily the let's say the traditional KPIs like total assets, ROE or whatever. But the mental map of the employees of the bank is built on that. So they see the effect or the impact of the bank translated in the size of credit lending, total assets, the size of the network, completely wrong. And it was a major transformation because the thing is not about the numbers. It's about the number of clients that we impact, number of jobs we were able to preserve, number of new employment, number of whatever, number of the improvement on sanity, a number, and this is quite interesting because we did it. Now the KPIs and the performance indicator of the people in BNDES is built or is based on number of clients, number of people impacted, number of households that were improved by sanity, whatever. And a lot of resistance from the internal employees. But again, in doing so, our main goal, which is irrigate the system, just one second on that. About, 10 years ago, the bank, BNDES, was a major distributor of subsidies in the economy. What's the problem of doing so? The one who received the subsidy is perfect. The thing is, the size of the market is the size of the subsidies. You cannot grow the market because you have an asymmetry. So the private sector cannot compete versus the subsidies, right? When in the government in the 2016, they closed the gap, no longer subsidies into the economy through BNDES. Though they create a new index, TLP, and there's no implicit subsidies in this TLP. But the fact is, when we did this change, BNDES doesn't have any comparative advantage in terms of distributing our funds. So what was the thing? In fact, on the duration of the line, we have some. It's more beneficial to the one who takes the care of the credit. But the thing is, we have to compete. We have to improve our projects. We have to improve our customer-centric mindset. And the bank is more prepared to do the work, to do the job. And at that time, the time of the subsidies, they have a sort of an expression that reflect very well the thing. It's what they call the national champions. So you define from industrial policy or public policy, who will be the winners in each sector. What we have done? Well, have done some winners, in fact. JBS is an example. Odebrecht is not a good example. A lot of corruption because you concentrate the power, you concentrate the support of the state in one or two winners among the sectors. What we have done, we do a sort of a turnaround, and instead of calling them national champions, and we inside the bank, the signature, now we focus on the national heroes, which is the small entrepreneurs, the business owners that irrigate the micro activity on the economy and preserve jobs. So this thing and the most challenging thing is to transform the mental map of the employee of the bank.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting where you bring in Bruno. It's interesting, the story of BNDES, that for a while it has changed also its a funding structure. It was depending on national treasury and it has multiplied by 4 its investment during 6-8 years in the 2000s. And then that's why, just to give a bit of context for those who are not that familiar with BNDES, this de-investing, it also has to do with getting back to a funding structure that depends less on federal budget and national treasury, getting back to a BNDES that has more autonomy too. But it's very interesting that you brought the project finance, the way you act. We have been together in the venture capital fund. They drove us in, which is great. Private debt, environmental assets, and also the very important role of development banks on during the pandemic, as with the counter-cyclical package. That's something that's very classical. What do development banks do? We do public goods, positive externalities, and we do counter-cyclical. And some of the national banks were the drivers of this policy in several countries, and that was the case in Brazil, where not only the credit lines and the way guarantee funds were designed, and we, as partners, we have used a lot FGE that has been a great basis for small businesses, but also stand still. So we have built deferrals from 6 months and then 1 year during COVID. That was a very important role. And I would say that having 6 distributors has been having a huge impact, since we're talking about last mile, on working with cooperatives and fintechs. And that's also the way that we are larger than the majority of the distributors. We are from the first and second, and now we do the same thing. Because if you want to go to the small city or to small market of 30, the boulangerie, the coffee place in that, it's very small city. We cannot do that. We are too big to do that. But we have all this capillarity that we build with cooperatives and fintechs that, and in our case, social OCPs, this is non-profit kind of cooperatives that are very interesting in model. Carlos, I'm bringing you in because you have a different perspective too. You work with cities. Boitumelo talked a little bit about how you prepare projects for municipalities, for localities, and how you report in this technical assistance role. But FMDB has been having a huge role in assistance, finance in common, and assistance alliance of Latin American subnational development banks on what our challenges. So I would love to hear about you from your perspective, because he's not a bank, but they've been working with development financial institutions and with governments around the world, the local governments. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about what are challenges and what are the tools that you've been seeing on the ground that are working well.
Thank you.
But also the flaws. I've sent emails to everyone saying, say the good stories, but say the flaws too, because this is important for us to understand where we can improve.
Thank you, Leonie. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, great. Thank you. First, thank you to Bruno and Boitumelo. We love DBSA and we love BNDES for different reasons.
And you love BNDES too, because that is my former bank.
Yeah, and I love you.
Love.
You do remember we had last year a conference at COP. You were present and very early in the morning, and I thanked you for that. No, well, BNDES and DBSA are very special, meaning they are not subnational development banks as we define them, meaning specific mandated banks which work with local and regional governments in making happening the projects at a level which is often regional, meaning for Brazil at the state level. You have a very good experience in Brazil and Latin America. In Africa, it's very different, but still, DBSA is a very, very interesting and relevant model because they are agile. And Bruno was saying about this change of mindset of the public servants within the bank, of getting more like the private sector influence in the way they've been thinking their active contribution to the change of the society. You were talking, Leonie, about the counter-cycle packages that public development banks do deliver, and it's key. But it's a mix in between what the new orientation of BNDES and DBSAs that we need, depending on the context. Brazil is not even South Africa. It's very different context. the quality of basic services in the cities of Brazil are very different from the ones we meet in Africa and Southern Africa especially. So it's different mandates somehow, because it's different also contexts and different ways of actuing there. So just to go back to FMDV, yes, we are an international network of cities and regions, local and regional governments. We are a political network, which means that we are governed by mayors and governors. Still, we are very specific and unique in the galaxy of networks internationally. We were mandated by UCLG, which is basically the UN of local and regional governments, to specifically work on financing. Because at one point, when we were created in 2011, when we were created, we were still, and Bruno will understand what I'm talking about. We were still talking about local finance, meaning everything was supposed to come and to be done by local and regional governments, and through their own budget and not off budget, which is a very specific culture that we need to bring because if we need to achieve the global agendas, we need to go fast, and we cannot wait for decentralization processes to apply and to give the framework and the tools, and more specifically the human resources, skilled ones, to be integrated in the local government's administration. This is key. I'm not talking about country specifics. If you go to South Africa, you will meet financial engineers in the big metropolises that are really engineering very, very specific and dedicated tools and mechanisms to finance the local or regional governments projects. But basically, in most of the cities around the world, you will not find a CFO that is capable of dealing with private sector, dealing with even the procurement process. This is key to understand that we need the wide array of solutions, the wide array of institutions, the wide array of typologies of support funds, subsidies, project preparation, like DBSA is applying. Of course, blended finance vehicles for local and regional projects. So what we have seen from my point of view since our creation, basically, and what we have pushed for is to have a specific advocacy and putting emphasis on the role of intermediation. These subnational development banks, what we call subnational development banks, it can be once again a bank or a fund that is specifically mandated to support the financing of local and regional governments, but it can also be a branch of BNDES. So BNDES can be subnational development banks if the market for local and regional projects is big enough, and we have specific tools applied to support the strategies and plans that are defined politically at the local level. Basically, we need this intermediation for several reasons that Bruno raised. It's a mindset change. It's creating a new culture of deals closure. That's very key. We need infrastructure to be implemented in those cities and regions, because there is an urge for urbanization now. We need to address the needs, the demand, and this can only be done by institutions that do understand the processes at the local level. We need to always remind ourselves that there is no such thing as a financial system for local and regional governments. What does that mean? We have the generic financial system, we have the public, the private system. They work more or less well together, but it's it used to be at a national level. And we've been discussing here with Bruno about reaching out to the SMEs, building the financial infrastructure to support, and architecture to support them in delivering more jobs, preserving jobs, more jobs, innovation, technological creation, etc. But that's the same thing that we need for local and regional governments because of the decentralization process. Globally, since the end of 1980s, we are in a process of decentralization. It's very slow, and especially on financing, because you can imagine that we should have, at least at regional level, the equivalent of ministers of finance, the equivalent of national treasury, to understand the reality, the needs, the opportunities that are arising from the development happening at the local and regional governments, but we don't have them. We don't have the financial expertise. Even we don't have the advisory firms that are equipped to understand the processes of the public administration at local and regional governments level. So it is key that intermediation, and DBSA in its history was a national bank, and then it spread in the whole Southern Africa area because of its excellency, because of the commitment to support development. And that's a key element in both Bruno's and Boitumelo interventions, which is being a public development bank. It's not being a private and commercial bank or private investor. We don't have the same kind of mandate. We need to support the access to basic service to everyone. That's a core mandate. Not all of the development banks actually, and national banks or subnational development banks have this very important mandate integrated in the status of the bank, translated technically, which impedes somehow and sometimes certain interventions from these key players. But still, so what we have seen is, and what FMDV has done is put some visibility, emphasis on this intermediation process and players. Especially in 2016, what we achieved and was very defining moment is to integrate in the Habitat 3 document, final document, a reference to subnational development banks and pooled financing mechanisms, meaning bringing together small projects to achieve the scale that is sexy enough even for public development banks, but also for private sector. And we have historically, and we have in certain countries, examples of this kind of mechanisms which are very successful, but not replicated in the process of decentralization, which means we don't have DBSAs or BNDES in all the countries of the world, which impedes this subnational frontier market to arise, and that's very key. So what we are trying to do since then is with the Latin America and Caribbean Alliance of Subnational Development Banks. It's been 1 year since we launched the initiative under the Financing Common umbrella. What we are trying to do is put everyone together around the table and make the connection. We are, as FMDV, very basically mediators. We put together, we are conveners, we put together the whole financing chain players around the table, and we've somehow, by this political convening power that we have, we force them to discuss and to discover that basically they want the same thing at the end of the day, but they have different ways of supporting the implementation of these tools, of these financial mechanisms. So, yes, sorry, very long.
I think 1 minute for you to, well, I interrupt you, can I? Or do you want to finish? Just for us to keep going on the debate, and I'm asking you to join us soon. I was just going to ask anyone in the room if you have questions, because you have only 10 minutes to go. And I'd like to just look a little bit to the future and think of, it's a very quick question and 3 minutes each. what if we look ahead, if you look for the next decade, what is the change, the one change that you do? I'm just copying 9 words yesterday. So if you had a magic wand, what would you change? What would you push for so that this matter of not having these brilliant institutions so spread that we can reach out? What should we do? Because what Carlos is bringing is so important. We have how many? Well, I just don't have. I have this number every day in my mind, but not today, of course. The number of subnationals that we have is what, half of the system of the 527 banks or DFI institutions. We have subnational banks is a large quantity, but as Carlos is bringing, they do not have the same quality of the most well-known national and development and multilaterals. Everybody when talk about development banks, we think IaDB, we think New Development Bank, we think European Investment Bank, we think DBSA, we think Eastern African, we think BNDES, we think SIDBI. That has changed because it was really bad in the 90s, right? But it has changed and improved. So what is this thing that we should do? Because BNDES was reaching out for distributors, the good ones, right? But there are many agências de fomento, development finance institutions that probably are not accessing BNDES because they don't have the quality governance, the requirements to join. And probably you could work with other institutions that are already there, but they are not joining because they don't have the requisites. One thing, and I'm starting from the last one because I interrupted him. So, Carlos, what is the one thing that you do to change this? A practical, operational, or a strategic thing that you think it should be done?
Oh, this is such complex question.
I don't like easy questions. And that's why moderators only the easy ones when I'm the panelist.
We only have 3 minutes. So what I will say is what we need is national strategies first, but that put a real emphasis of financing local deals. It's very weird, but usually when we think about finance, it's at the end of the day, we talk about planning, we talk about project preparation, technical assistance, blah, blah, blah. But still, the mechanics, the financial engineering, the market for advisory firms for this segment do not exist or are not enhanced enough to support the implementation of the political strategies that are designed at the local and regional level. Not enough. And we don't have the new elites that we need. We need new elites of financial engineers that go and work with local and regional governments and that can create and have the same language of the national public development banks, but also of the private sector. This is key. Bruno is a very good example. He came from outside to make a revolution in BNDES. And we need this kind of moves, and because it's an exchange. He learned also from BNDES capabilities of changing the things, and BNDES is learning from him. But it's very, imagine, it's been hard, it's been a revolution in BNDES. Imagine only what it can be at the local level with the development banks that are focusing on subnational. And we need this to happen more and more. So we need new professionals. That's key. Again and again, it's human resources, skilled. And Brazil, it's always very impressive because there is, and in Africa also, we have youth. We have people, students in masses. The thing is, we cannot wait for them for having like 10 years a training and experience, and then they are ready to come and join the process of answering the emergency of urban development and climate. So we need to find processes of training that put these youth in place faster and specifically on these financial mechanisms. And for this, we need experts. We need them to transfer their knowledge and in quick ways. But how? This is the big question. And somehow this kind of policy action labs, alliances where we put together the people around the table are one key element, because basically, if we have someone that is willing to, then it will spread in the group.
Thank you, Carlos. I'm bringing Boitumelo back to tell us what she would do if she could change something to get this ecosystem working better for the next decade.
I think, I mean, it's one of the things that we are doing as DBSA. You know, when you look at, for instance, the South African landscape of the subnational government, only 20, I think between 25 to 30% of those municipalities can borrow. So they have, you know, access to capital over and above fiscal allocation. And one of the challenges that most have is obviously weak revenue base, and also governance, governance challenges as well. So what we are doing as DBSA, we are then saying we actually going to put in capacity in those municipalities to to enhance their governance, and in addition to that, also create technical capacity within those municipalities. And that is something we are doing out of our own resources. And that's at the under-resourced municipalities. We also have a challenge around urban migration, where the cities are also under a lot of pressure. And I think the assumption is that cities can handle this pressure. And I think the opportunity we have as a development finance institution is to have a different conversation with our cities, because currently we fund our metros to then say what are those initiatives that we can develop together with our cities, whether it be on the planning side, the preparation side, to just relieve some of those pressures from the cities, and even create project development of opportunities to address issues around energy security, water availability, and even looking at bulk infrastructure as well. And this will entail DBSA also strengthening its capital base as well as a development finance institution, and leveraging the sources of funds that we have access to, but also at a cost, at a lower funding cost. I mean, I have the opportunity to have one of my funders here, the New Development Bank. Thank you, Leslie, for all the support. And that is going to be quite critical. And this is something that we have seen, working well for us when you look at the green bonds that we have raised during a difficult period during COVID. We did a 200 million green bond with the French Development Bank, 200 million euros, yes. And then we did an equivalent of $250 million with PIMCO, and this was from a program with UNECA. And this goes back to your answer, to your question on leveraging partnership, and this we did in local currency. By the way, this green bond with PIMCO, I mean, it's like the biggest asset manager in the world, and they actually managed to fund DBSA. So expansion of funding sources will also be critical for us to then strengthen our capital base, so that we can continue to support the subnational and getting the development impact that we desire, but doing it in a financially sustainable manner.
Very good. Can I sign in? So, Bruno, you're going to wrap up this. So be very short, please.
That's right. This interesting discussion, and I want to point out what Claudia mentioned. Most of the time, we discuss ourselves, I mean, what the bank should do, blah, blah, blah. I think it's a wrong angle. The angle should start by the problem. So, Brazil, let's focus on Brazil. Brazil has many problems, for sure. I can summarize in two: inequality, income inequality, and the productivity of the economy. So, these two things. And this is an interesting case of BNDES. Inequality. Let's talk a little bit about inequality. The guarantee funds to instill, to ignite the microeconomy through the MSME is a sort of an important tool set to reduce inequality, to enlarge the entrepreneurship ecosystem, etc. But very interesting example in the discussion of the strategic planning of BNDES last year. With our discussion with the board of the bank, we have defined that BNDES has a role in education. It was never written in any place. Education is an issue of the Minister of Education. By the way, didn't do a good job. and then we capture a piece of this mandate for BNDES. Development Bank, we are not specialized in education. As a matter of fact, we have a small cell to finance schools or to finance, some education plays. But we define that education is a major platform for the bank, not for the bank, but for the bank to try to solve or to reduce the issues of education, and consequently, you got to reduce inequality, etc. So we define, from venture philanthropy to blended finance to grants to finance everything related to the basis of education in Brazil. I think it's a good example how we tackle this thing, how we're going to work with the subnationals. And my experience from being an outsider,
not anymore. 4 years.
By the way, the best experience of my life. You're gonna be. It's all about disintermediation. It's all about disintermediation because scale, because being digital, because the funding, the funding structure. It's all about disintermediation. So the only way, it's a bit of exaggeration for sure, but the way to preserve the role of the subnational, etc., is because the subnational has more expertise in dealing with the specifics of the client segments. And when Boitumelo mentioned about technical support, how to prepare a project, how to do some project finance, limited recourse, non-recourse, sanity. If the subnational do not be an expert or be very much specialized in certain areas, we're gonna disintermediate because it's just a cost of transaction. Why you need it? Because you can irrigate, and you have the same issues with your distributors, right? You can irrigate economy directly. Right now, you don't need the branches because you can do it digitally. And so the only way to preserve the value, and it's not about, it's not about preserve because you need to preserve. It's about preserve because in the value chain, the subnatural will generate more value. That's the only way to preserve. And this is about specialization. This is about technical expertise. And I'm going to end with this thing. When you arrive at the bank, started to read the contracts, the finance contracts, all the lending, blah, 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 regulation, blah, blah, blah. And there's the client did not appear in any paper. The client. There's no client papers of BNDES. The name was beneficiary. Instead of saying, I have a client, I have a beneficiary. And this, I think it's translate quite well. I'm saying about subsidies. I'm saying about the guy who take the loan is a beneficiary. It's not a client. So in that regard, we need to have this client-centric mentality. And this is the way to preserve the role and the value creation of the subnational.
Thank you, Bruno, very much. I think we've had a great warm-up, this first panel, talking about how to spread what we've been doing and strengthening the system in its base, in its smaller, what do you call it, distribution, what I'm calling the last mile, because it's exactly where the final drop of money it's going to. So thank you very much for all of you. Thank you, Carlos, for joining in.
Thank you.
Send my regards to Emily. She couldn't join us today.
Sorry, she was taken down by COVID.
Oh, sorry.
That's why.
Hear that.
No, I really want to thank you because it's of course really interesting. I would love to discuss with you for hours because we have so much to say about the topic. But thank you. It was really relevant as always on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you all, and a big clap for everyone here. Bye-bye, Carlos.
Bye.
So we're suspending now for 25 minutes. We're getting back at 10:30 on climate change.
Climate change.
Yes. Yes. Well,
let me check my don't really look at each other. Yes, okay.
thank you. So good morning, everyone. Can you hear us well? Doesn't hear us? Brilliant. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. We just had a great panel on last mile basis work challenges and looking ahead, what are the building blocks that we have to put together to deliver more. And now I'm just handing on here the word to our brilliant moderator, it's Thomas Hale. We call him Tom. Thomas is a faculty, he's associate professor here at Blat School of Government and has been working for many years now on climate change, green finance, and writing and teaching and convening about this issue. So I'm just handing it over to you, and that's your floor.
Thank you, Liani, and thank you everyone for joining today. It's really a great topic to be able to dig into because, of course, we are sitting just 1 week before the next Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. I think a number of us will be together in Sharm el-Sheikh next week to talk about it. And the main topic of conversation will be, well, there'll be many, but the biggest one I would say will be finance, because this is the ingredients needed for implementation, and it's all about implementation and action. And so finance is very much at the top of the agenda, and it's also probably the most controversial topic because of the controversies around who should give what to whom to do what. But just stepping back from the politics of it, I think if you think about where we are globally on the Sustainable Development Goals, we've really seen a lost set of years because of COVID. The president of Colombia, former president of Colombia, was here recently. He's a fellow in school this year, and he was saying that Colombia has lost 4 years of progress in the development goals because of COVID. So how the world builds resilience, how the world becomes better prepared to manage these kinds of shocks is actually fundamental to the short-term immediate pressures that we face. I think about it sometimes as a trade-off between the long-term and the short-term, but of course the short-term manifestations of these issues are all deeply connected to the long-term challenges. So it's really quite existential, to be very blank, about how can the world mobilize the amount of resources and investments needed to adapt to this reality. So I don't think it's too exaggerated or grandiose to say that actually the work of the organizations in this room, the success of the organizations here is actually on this issue is critical to the global agenda that we're trying to deliver and indeed for the livelihoods of everyone who lives on this complicated planet that we share. With that, I think we have 4 fantastic speakers to help us think about what's going on this agenda in your organizations. Where are you coming to the innovations that are helping us think about how to do it better, where the barriers are rising, and what can we expect going forward. So I will ask each speaker to speak for 10 minutes, ideally even a little bit less so we can have more time for conversation, but I will let you know when there's a few minutes left before 10 so you have a chance to finish up. We have 2 in the room and 2 online, and I'm not going to introduce them extensively because that will take a little bit of time. So I'm just very delighted that we have Claudia Arce, from Head of Latin America and Caribbean from KfW, joining us online. Bruno Lankes here in the room, Managing Director of BNDES from BNDES in Brazil. We have Fazia Pusterla, who is the IaDB Country Representative for Europe, also joining us online. Fazia. And here in the room to my right, Maarsdop, who is the Vice President of the New Development Bank. So with that agenda, let's go in the order written here on the document and start, if I may, with you, Claudia, to tell us a little bit about how this is looking from your perspective. Welcome. Claudia, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we hear you well.
Okay. Yeah, so good morning to everybody. So I was a bit confused with the time zones, so I was in the room 2 hours ago, but I think I'm right now to join. I don't know whether you can see the presentation and the slides I've prepared because I cannot see them. Are they on screen?
No, we don't see them. Are you able to share them or?
No, I'm not but I've sent them yesterday.
Okay, we can put them together.
But anyway, I can start talking a little bit. So let me very briefly, shortly introduce KfW to you or to all of you who maybe are not so familiar with the bank. So KfW is more than 70 years old by now. It was founded after World War II, mainly at that time to reconstruct Germany. And in the meantime, we are a very, very large development bank, mainly in domestic business. Yeah, here it is. So please, next slide. And I think it's a very unique business model because it really allows us to, with the governance we have, to react very, very rapidly on the mandate we have. So be it energy transformation, which I will talk about in a minute, be it COVID situation, due to the very good rating we have. I think that's the key issue. I mean, we don't receive much funds from our government, but we have the AAA rating, and with this AAA rating, we can fund ourselves on a very large scale on the international financial markets. You see that in 21, which was an exceptional year, the refinancing volume on capital markets was more than 100 billion euros. So I think that's very unique. It's very different, but it allows us to react very quickly in these situations, especially in situations where we have crisis. And I mean, as we all know, we are coming from one crisis to the next. There was the COVID crisis, we have the Ukraine crisis, we have the gas crisis now. So it continues a little bit in the same shape. So next, please. So your question were a little bit also the trade-off between the pandemic, the trade-off between energy transformation. So very briefly, only to give you an example, KfW is in the green financing for many, many years and in energy transformation. 21 was a very strong COVID year. So our share of energy transformation financing was lower than in the years before. It was only at 53% of our total commitments, so roughly 50 billion. But at the same time, we could also issue quite substantial amount of green bonds, which helps financing the green agenda, the green transition, up to 16.1 billion. But I think the question was also, what are the challenges, and what are the challenges, especially now, with kind of trade-off between social issues, between green transformation. And I think within KfW, we are really discussing this very, very strongly, because as you know, maybe you go to the next slide. We have different banks in the bank. So we have a large part of domestic promotion, and we have the international business. And in the international business, we have IPEX Bank, which is a classical Exim bank for German producers and European producers. And we have the development bank where I come from. So for the development bank, it's not so difficult because our mandate is very strongly on green, on climate protection, on climate resilience. And it has always been. But for an international export and project finance bank, it's a totally different issue, because we were financing gas, we were financing shipping industry, etc. So how to cope with COP and with Paris Paris alignment. So I think that's one of the big challenges for us right now in the Development Bank and in KfW Group, to comply with, to become Paris compatible in all the different sectors, and especially in the international one, it's not easy going. So what did we do in 21? We adopted the first 6 sector guidelines to become Paris compatible, which is really tough if you trickle down on the investment. So this was with regard to shipping, automotive, iron and steel, buildings, electricity generation, and aviation. And I think in the medium term, the big challenge is really how to reduce this even more and how to introduce a group-wide impact management. Because on the political level, on the strategy level, it's quite clear what we have to do. But when it comes to, when the trickle down comes, when we have to really finance, when we have to monitor the financing, when we have to ask our clients to really deliver all the data we need to measure energy transformation, it becomes much more complicated. So that's more or less the medium-term challenge to the group. It's the systematic recording and management of the carbon footprint on the new portfolio. And in the long run, or in the medium to long-term run, it's really to achieve net zero emissions in our total loan portfolio, which is quite challenging as well. So you jump to the next quickly. That's only to give you a short overview on how much on the KfW development business, which is a part, as you have seen in the pillars, how much is green and adaptation. It's all, except for 20 and 21, it was always more than 60% of our portfolio. 20 and 21 exceptions due to COVID, but I think this year we will come back to more than 60%. Actually, in Latin America, the green financing is more than 80%. It has been more than 80% in the last 10 years, mainly due to large portfolio natural resources financing and on biodiversity. But that's only statistics. Let me give you now 2 examples how we can do this. And first, in the next slide, you will see a little bit the sectoral, the sectors we are dealing. So it seems it's not there. 1 back, 2 back, 2 slides back, please. 1, yeah, exactly. So that's a little bit what you said in the introduction. How to combine these different challenges, the different sectors with energy transformation, how to combine poverty and poverty increasing due to the pandemic, and at the same time make societies more climate resilient, especially in the poorest countries. So for us in all these sectors, and these are the main sectors we are active in the development bank, and especially in Latin America, it's really to have climate and climate protection and energy transition as a cross-cutting topic. So what has changed in the past? Nowadays, when we do the due diligence of programs, of projects, we look much more in depth on climate resilience, on circular economy, and this is an integral part of the analysis we are doing. So with this, you try to avoid a little bit the trade-off. You can't avoid it always. It's difficult because you will have areas where you have to take a decision and you have to kind of weight your decision. And then it really becomes political. But I think from the methodology side, we are much more in a position today to really analyze the different areas in a way to have a much better picture on the linkages, on the relationships between climate, society, security, health, and all these topics. So,
2 more minutes, please.
Yeah, to finalize, I give you 2 examples which are a little bit different from the classical infrastructure financing. which we also continue to do, so to finance green energy, to finance renewable energy. So one is a fund we have set up with others together, which is really to kind of bring in more private sector into public finance, because I think we all know, and I think you have discussed this in the other sessions, we need private money because there is not enough public money to finance the green transition and transformation. So I think we have all together to look much more at kind of instruments where we can leverage and where we can bring in the private sector and have a huge leverage. So the La Green is one example where we bring in some seed capital from the public sector to take risks, and we try to encourage private sector putting money in the fund, and then with this fund and technical assistance to increase the amounts of green funding in the Latin American market. So that's a kind of a new product we launched 3 years ago, and the volume for the first closing would be roughly 500 million euros. And the second example I brought with me, it's on the next slide, which is also different and where I really also see development banks and public banks helping to accelerate the framework conditions. So together with others, and you will see it's IDB, it's AFD, so a big, large number of development banks joined hands in Colombia as an example. I mean, we do the same in other countries to really encourage the government to set up the framework conditions to allow sustainable and resilient growth in the country. So I brought these two examples because they're a little bit atypical. On one hand, a fund with the aim to bring in more private capital to the green transformation, and with the PVL policy-based loans, how to change governance in specific countries, how to accelerate the governance, the law systems, the regulation, to really enable the private markets to come in with green financing. And I stop here, and thanks for listening, and open for the discussion.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Those are two very interesting and concrete and helpful examples of the kinds of things that I know people are excited to dig into more detail. Let's then turn to here in the room. We have Bruno Laskowsky from BNDES to stay in the Latin American region to talk a little bit about what's going on in your work.
First of all, thank you again for the privilege of being here. This is the agenda. And let me start giving you some main points to drive the discussion. 85% of the electricity matrix in Brazil is renewable. 50% of the energy matrix in Brazil is renewable. Even human mobility in Brazil is around 25%. So the issue of Brazil is not necessarily about the transition itself. The issue of Brazil is about avoiding deforestation and reforestation. So all the strategy, and BNDES is very active on that, is trying to create mechanisms and economic incentives to preserve the forests. We have all the numbers in terms of we have defining the building block of our support for this transition or this climate change strategy, built on credit and guarantees, built on project preparation. So just to give you a number, we have at BNDES right now 13 million hectares in parks and conservational units that we are doing concessions and PPPs. We are launching this to the market. And this is an amazing opportunity because the thing is, how are we going to create conditions for the local population to preserve the nature, and this easy speech they have to preserve. But if we do not create the right incentives, who is doing the deforestation is not the tradition or the stereotype of the bad guys. Now it's the guy who lives there. A piece of it. Of course, there are bad guys always, but a piece of it. So it's about creating a systemic defense, first, second line of defense of this thing. So this is part of the equation. The other thing is about the grant. And the other thing, which is the main strategy of the bank, is everything related to carbon credits. And we launched an initiative with McKinsey and B3. B3 is a stock exchange in Brazil, to launch, to design and to create a sort of a model that Brazil would be a main actor on VCM, the voluntary carbon credit market. The projection by 2030 will have between 50 to 100 billion US dollars in VCM. And Brazil, the natural share of Brazil is 15% of that number. So in terms of balance of payments, Brazil can play this game as a tradable asset, carbon credits, as a tradable asset of 15 billion US dollars. Just to give you a number, today, animal protein on our balance of payment represents 6 billion US dollars. If we build this, I'm going to touch the regulated market as well, but we do believe that this thing will get along with parallel. Eventually, they're going to merge, but the thing is, if we build this model, we're going to generate on an annual basis around from 600,000 to 900,000 new jobs to keep the population there and create the right incentives. Is a major effort. In this effort, we are creating a sort of, by the way, three main pillars on that thing to really work. Taxonomy, I'm going to spend some time talking about taxonomy of carbon credits. The governance, and governance means also some organization, but also advocacy, so all together. And the third pillar of this thing is related to exchanges. So I'm going to share some of the internal discussions. Brazil is well known by being a food security provider to the world. And we do believe that Brazil can play this game also on carbon credits. Brazil would be or will be a sort of an energy provider, security provider for the world. But on the food ecosystem, the pricing decision is done in Chicago or in China. So a crucial discussion, a geopolitical discussion right now that we are trying to shape is how we're gonna capture this opportunity, and don't let the pricing discussion be outside of the region. And we believe that we're gonna have some exchanges in a broader spectrum, maybe in Asia, in Europe, whatever. But one of them, for us, is a key element of this strategy to have this on a regional basis, and perhaps São Paulo. So we're going to the COP27 next week, and one of the key topics we're gonna pitch, we're gonna present that this and be very vocal of Brazil being a key actor on this thing. And just to finalize this initial remarks, we have two main areas or building blocks and how we address the thing about this climate change. One is everything related to NBS. And we do believe that we have some edge on that. Can mention some very interesting cases. And everything, and the other building block is about decarbonization tech. In these two areas, we're launching, and this is about, remember that I mentioned the capital recycling strategy that we divest from the public equity thing, from Petrobras, JBS, and Vale, everything, because from a perspective of being a development bank, don't need to have public equity at that level. And a piece of it we recycle through technology funds and climate tech funds. So we're starting to ignite the fund management ecosystem with local general partners, and we are bringing general partners from abroad with a lot of expertise, especially in clean tech. And together we are doing some corporate ventures where BNDES is, we have a minority, we are a relevant LP, together with the, let's say, the local and external expertise, creating this corporate venture, again, to invest in NPS and also to invest in tech related to decarbonization. So it's a bunch of initiatives, but definitely I think that from a strategic point of view, what's the main goal? Brazil will play this game, and this is the game for Brazil.
Fascinating and fantastically interesting. I know one of our students here has been working on a big paper, not here today, but Lucilla has been working on a paper.
She's online.
Oh, she's online.
I was sending her a message now. She's my
Here. Yeah.
Are you here? Okay.
Lucilla, welcome. She's done a great paper being published today on the Amazon Fund, which is one of these international financing mechanisms, which had very interesting design, big ambitions. They have struggled a little bit in the last few years to operationalize those. But yeah, sure, she can tell us more about that. Let me turn first to our next speaker, who is also online, who is Fazia Pusterla from the IaDB. Fazia, welcome. Wonderful to have you here. I wonder if you might say a few words about how the IaDB is confronting this transition.
Yes, thank you so much, and I'm very sorry I could not join you in person finally, but I'm delighted to be contributing to this very interesting conversation we are having. And yesterday you also had already Reina Mejia from remotely joining you for the opening session. I have some slides also, so if we can project them, maybe I can talk over them. Well, first of all, as you know, and maybe as Claudia did, in general terms, I would like to spend just a few words on what Inter-American Development Bank Group does, and how our objective contributes directly to accelerating climate change financing. So we work to improve lives in Latin America and the Caribbean. And of course, we prioritize social inclusion and equality, productivity and innovation, and regional economic integration. We seek to address gender equality and diversity, climate change, and environmental sustainability as transversal topics, together with institutional capacity and the rule of law. We began in 1959 and have gone a long way to being the leading source of development financing for the region. Let me focus now on last year, 2021, which was a record year when we approved over $20 billion through loans, technical assistance, and other instruments. These including both our public sector window and the private sector one. Please, next slide. And now going to more specifically to the topic of our conversation. Of these 20 billion that we approved, 6 billion are to climate finance. And we are working this year, which is coming almost to the end, to break these record volumes. Of course, in addition to our own capital, it is very important, and we were stressing this in previous session as well, to leverage a variety of additional resources, concessional and blended climate resources, to help address market failures. And these resources that are limited oblige us to crowd in also private sector capitals. And we are aware that dozens of government intervention private sectors from investing in net zero emissions and climate resilient solutions. And these barriers include building the necessary infrastructure, implementing regulatory reforms or mandates, getting prices right, providing targeted subsidies, building capacity, providing information. The list is very long. In relative terms, we provide a lot of climate finance given the size of our portfolio, indeed, but we must be candid about the Latin American Caribbean needs, because there is an estimated needs of $800 billions. So, okay, we can focus on volumes, but indeed the conversation here should focus not necessarily on spending more, but spending differently. And at the IDB group, we are increasingly focused on how to align our operations to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And this means aligning financial flows towards net zero emissions and climate resilience in a way that is compatible with countries' own plans, as well as in the Paris Agreement, which was signed by, and this is very relevant, by all of our member countries. And finally, let me just point out to some interesting results that our own research points out about the transition in LAC to net zero emissions that can have net benefits. So overall, the cost of decarbonization in Latin America and the Caribbean is outweighed by the economic and social benefits. Yes, projected benefits include 1% additional economic growth and the creation of 15 million net new jobs by 2030. Yes, so for instance, the wind and solar are now the cheapest and most abundant resources of energy available, and electric vehicles are competitive in some markets and their costs will continue to fall, while the price of fossil fuels is more volatile and depends on exogenous factors, as demonstrated, of course, by the effects of COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine. Okay, but again, let's focus on what our research shows in terms of winners and losers. So new jobs would be created in plant-based agriculture and renewable energy sectors, and jobs would be lost in fossil fuel and cattle sectors. So for example, Chile is replacing all coal power plants, yes, by renewable energy. So this is something that we're also taking into account. Also focusing on policies, we are very committed in making sure that policies can be designed to ensure a just transition of the workforce. And this we're actively working with all of our member countries in terms of the support that we can provide in designing and implementing these policies. So let me quickly go to the next slide where we can see and maybe provide you a couple of examples. So at first sight, again, I was mentioning we need to have the right policies in place and advanced planning. And we believe that countries we work with can tackle multiple issues. Yes, so there is a space for MDBs and of course for IDB to really contribute to aligning priorities and planning that allows for value for money. And so the reality is that the limited volume of financing that MDBs can offer, I was mentioning before the enormous financing need in this area the region has, we believe that we can provide, the possibility to stretch each dollar that is invested to its maximum potential. So this is our goal. And a long-term view can help countries minimize and compensate for losses, and a fundamental value added of the MDBs resides exactly in this capacity of planning, and advice towards this direction. So currently IDB is working with several countries in terms of planning. I mentioned a few, you can see them in the map: Argentina, Barbados, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Peru, Suriname, and Uruguay. So for example, we've supported Costa Rica in the development of its national decarbonization plan. And for example, on the private sector side, I will give you a couple of ideas of innovative projects. For example, in Chile, hand in hand with ENGIE, we have financed a wind farm developed by ENGIE that will replace a number of coal plants. And this is very interesting because we have included to this project the mobilization from 2 additional funds that allow for a reduction in pricing equivalent to the avoided emissions. So this is also an aspect that we're really working on in terms of innovative financing and crowding in of additional resources. Also, we have worked in both projects. I had the same examples that Claudia was showing, that are both very innovative. I will not repeat them, of course, but I would like to end stressing the importance of partnering with other multilateral banks, with development national banks, with additional private sector resources. And in both examples that Claudia already shared with you, IDB and IDB Invest were strongly committed and working together with our countries and with partners. If you can go to the last slide, please. I just wanted to share very briefly here few examples. We have many, many more of some publications, both related to public and private sector, where we believe an institution like IDB Group can also contribute to these kind of conversations and the policy conversations and conversations with private sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fazia. This is a really wonderful coincidence that you and Claudia had similar examples, and it really underscores your final point on partnership and collaboration. Even asynchronous, unplanned partnership, spontaneous partnership is great in presentations. So thank you for that. Our final speaker is Leslie Maarsdop from NDB. So I think we might look beyond the Latin American region, where we've been focusing a lot, and see what else, how this transition is looking in other contexts. And Leslie, welcome. What is your view on this subject?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think maybe just to start out, as you mentioned earlier on, COVID has really shone a very bright spotlight on the need and the important role of multilateral institutions. In fact, I would argue that COVID really sort of provided a boost and an injection to multilateral banks, specifically looking at how we can become more effective in executing our mandate, because the world is now dealing with a series of interconnected global challenges that countries on their own cannot solve by themselves, right? That these challenges, like climate change, cross borders, they are transnational in nature, and yet our funding instruments, our banks, our institutions are much more focused on the nation state or focused on a single country. So I think over the last couple of years, especially since the Paris Agreement, MDBs have begun to work together in a much more collaborative fashion. I'll give you a few examples. MDB started to do joint reporting on climate finance. So, it's very important now that we begin to standardize data, metrics, so we can speak the same language. one of the problems, and Bruno made reference to it, is the different taxonomies that exist. And it's clear that in order for us to make substantive progress going forward, we need to standardize metrics, standardize data, have more of a sort of convergence of approaches so that we can enable the broader agenda, which is about mobilizing more private sector capital into the sustainable agenda. I think it's important to sort of also look at the glass half full and maybe take a much more positive approach about the last few years despite COVID, and that is to say that COVID has not really led to a retreat on the climate agenda. There are a lot of evidence suggesting, for example, and I'll just maybe make three brief examples. The first one is just in terms of consumer behavior and public consciousness. There's no question that public awareness around climate change, people making decisions around choosing sustainable products, making that decision that is in line with a more climate friendly or carbon friendly future. The second maybe point to make is that within the financial services industry generally, if you look at the asset management industry, there's a much more explicit recognition that climate risk is investment risk. And climate risk is being factored into the value of securities, and therefore the entire asset management industry is changing, is undergoing quite fundamental changes. In other words, the focus on ESG is not just a sort of a niche focused anymore. It's now become mainstreamed and it's part of the core asset allocation conversations within the big asset management firms. Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, one of the biggest asset managers in the world, argues in his annual letter to shareholders that climate risk is investment risk. And that has really kind of set the tone for how the industry is changing. And the third major change, aside from consumers, what's happening in the industry, institutional investors, is around regulators. Regulators across the world. Basel now is looking at what they call green swan, trying to factor into their decisions around regulation of central banks to factor in the sort of net zero agenda. The next point that I'd like to make, and this is really sort of at the heart of what we spoke about yesterday, is that for us to materially advance the climate change agenda, we need to find ways, more innovative financial instruments and ways to mobilize private sector capital. MDBs constitute, or development banks constitute, a very small subsector within finance. We are really quite tiny. The combined balance sheets of all the MDBs together, all the leading ones, is around $2.5 trillion. If you look at the entire institutional investor pools of capital, it's north of $130 trillion. So we're really minute, but that therefore then calls for the importance of us to play much more of a catalytic role, to use our financing in much more imaginative ways rather than financing big climate-friendly projects. We should be just catalyzing those projects and use the power of leverage to bring in larger institutional investors. And maybe just 2 points of what I think would be some of the big trends going forward. I think there's some very interesting work currently underway, which we are tracking. There's a major project underway at Harvard, for example, which Sir Ron Cohen is leading around impact-weighted accounting. And what this essentially means is that the core and essential the heart of finance is risk return. Risk return is kind of the formula that everyone learns in finance 101. But it's clear that, for us to move forward in this new world towards net zero, it's not just about risk return, but it's also about impact. And if we can redesign our financial accounting metrics to incorporate, so when firms report on their profitability, they are also doing damage to the planet, and therefore you have to explicitly recognize what that damage is. So, for example, whereas Nestle, for example, in terms of the use of water, this project involving more than 2,000 firms is probably one of the most exciting projects underway, which Harvard University is doing significant work on. Then there's also a lot of work currently emanating from the International Sustainability Board, Standards Board, which emanated out of COP26 last year. The body has just been established. And I'm told that they are looking at some very fundamental concepts. They will relook at, for example, the concept of fiduciary duty to force directors to look at the concept of stranded assets into the medium term. So you can be profitable now, but in 20 years' time, if you're going to be stuck with stranded assets, you have not factored in a very, very significant variable into your equation to valuing that company today. So redefining the concept of fiduciary duty and what it actually means to be a director or custodian of a firm is something very interesting. And then a final point to make, what we are thinking about as New Development Bank is whether we should be looking at playing a bigger role in, for example, potentially being custodians of some of these fossil fuel assets. I'll give you an example of South Africa just to end off. South Africa has a very, very high coal energy grid. We have about 88% of our power is generated from coal. The country has a significant challenge in the sense that many of these power stations also reaches the end of its life cycle over the next decade. So there's a major decarbonization process underway to try and bring on board new sources of power. And one of the other very peculiar things about South Africa is all of these power stations are in one province. They're located in one area, and there's, probably 150,000 jobs associated with that industry. The coal mines, moving of the coal from the mines to the coal-fired power stations. And when these coal-fired power stations come to the end of the lifespan, livelihoods will be lost, and these will become deserted towns, for example, in our Mpumalanga province. So one of the things that we are thinking about now, is working in a public-private partnership format to look at who should be owning these power stations as they reach to the end of the lifespan. Maybe multilateral banks are better custodians because we're better custodians of the public good, maybe we should be owning those assets and sort of running them down to the end of their lifespan, because private sector in general does not have the sort of metrics. We look at development impact. When we look at the world, we don't look at profitability as the first consideration. So that's also the interesting debate taking place now of whether MDBs shouldn't be the ones actually owning coal-fired power stations and managing them better. At the moment, for example, we have a total green portfolio as a new development bank, and I'll end off with this. We have what we call last mover advantage. We started in 2015. The traditional concept you find is of comparative advantage is, being the first mover. Last mover advantage is where you can adopt the latest technological innovations. You can become the leader on the basis of the fact that you can learn from the mistakes and define next practices. In defining next practices is a whole series of things we are looking at. For example, on the energy side, because battery energy storage probably offers one of the most exciting new technological innovations. In short, what I'm saying is that it helps that you have institutions that have been created now, like Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank in Beijing, ourselves in Shanghai, where sustainable development is hard-coded in our articles of agreement in the statute. So you don't actually have the ability to finance a fossil fuel, for example, a new coal-fired power station. And maybe a case could be made for the mandates of development banks to be relooked at. Larry Summers have in fact argued that the World Bank should be changing their mandate because it is now outdated. And he says, in fact, the name should be changed also from International Bank for Reconstruction Development to International Bank for Sustainability or Sustainable Development, because the concept of, economic reconstruction after the war, which was really Keynes' idea, is probably outmoded in terms of what MDBs should be doing today. So there's some very interesting sort of trends underway that MDBs are thinking of, because we realize the leadership role that our industry has to play. World Bank and MDBs are some of the largest providers of climate finance in the world today.
Yeah. Fantastic, Leslie. I think you really highlight the interaction between the public and the private realm. And one of my hats that I wear is the chair of the independent expert group that reviews a lot of the financial alliances that were launched around net zero and COP26. So the Net Zero Bankers Alliance, Insurance Alliance, all these Glasgow alliances. And, they're moving quickly, maybe even one could say faster than some of the public sector entities, to define some of the type of taxonomies and methodologies for how to get to net zero alignment. But run into some hard barriers, as you say, who is going to own the last assets and wind them down in a way. And so how we figure out that balance of roles is really, really key. Thank you, speakers. You've given us a fantastic menu of ideas to launch from. We have about 15 minutes for discussion, so I really would welcome any comments. Please just raise your hand either online or in the room if you'd like to come in. And please keep the comments and questions short and snappy, and we'll have fast answers so we have a great conversation starting. And please introduce yourself if you come in.
Hi, my name is Weishan. I'm currently a DPhil student at the Department of International Development. So this is directly related. I have a very quick question for Claudia, for your institute. So in the first section this morning, we talk about the last mile implementation. And I understand that your institution has a lot of cooperation with your peering institution. And on the other hand, the sort of environmental and social responsibility is also one of the main focus of your institute. So I was sort of wondering how does your institute make sure that the sort of accountability, the responsibility is implemented to the last mile, or how did you share this kind of accountability with your partners? Yeah, thank you.
Can I add?
Please.
Just so we can
please.
I have two questions. One is sovereign versus non-sovereign operations. I think this is so important so that it can leverage in our countries, because we were discussing yesterday, Vivienne brought that issue of a bad premium for Africa and lower ratings and how it was damaged. And we have experienced that also in our bank, that having to go through sovereign operations was really taking 3 years instead of 6 years. So that's the first one. The second one is more on to Bruno on the climate change fund and the Amazon fund. If you could say just quick bits on how large they are and how are they today.
Can I start then with you, Claudia, on the question of shared accountability, and then maybe turn to Leslie on the sovereign versus non-sovereign operations, and Fazia as well, and then Bruno turn to you on the Amazon fund. But Claudia, please.
Okay, thanks for the question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So accountability, indeed, that's a very important question and very much to the point. So I think for KfW, we have a two-level approach. So it depends a little bit on the type of assets or programs we are financing, whether it goes through intermediaries or whether we do it directly with the final beneficiary. When it goes for intermediaries, like for instance, national development banks, which we fund a lot in many countries, we look at their systems. So when we do the due diligence, we look what kind of ESG systems, what kind of accountability, what kind of measures, what kind of know-how resources they have in place to really monitor the high ESG standards, where we normally, for public institutions, we follow World Bank standard, and for private, we follow IFC standard, like most of the other MDBs and financing partners do as well. When we find out that the ESG management systems are maybe still not to the level needed for the accountability, we try to support with additional technical assistance within the institutions, together with other MDBs or alone, but also here you're teaming up and trying to develop the process, the internal processes to guarantee this accountability and the monitoring. So that's for intermediaries. When it comes to direct financing of projects, then we have a direct dialogue with the partners, and we look on site when implementing how this is implemented. And often we have consultants also supporting in ESG questions, especially when it comes to very large infrastructure projects, which are on the A or B level, which means with potential high harm to environment, to societies, and things like this. Apart from this, so this is more in the day-to-day. Apart from this, definitely you have it in the legal documentation, but I think anybody has the obligations how to deal with the accountability. And as a kind of a second line of defense, we also go on site and we do spot checks on all the programs and all the financing to see whether it really works or not. So these are a little bit the three approaches with regard to accountability and ensuring that really the last mile is implemented.
Great. So Fazia and Leslie, can I ask you to think about this problem of sovereign versus non-sovereign operations? And just to put a point on it, the governor of Barbados has made this pitch very strongly that they can't borrow enough money because they have a bad credit rating. And because they can't borrow money, they can't make investments in climate resilience. And because they can't make investments in climate resilience, their credit rating is very bad. So how do we get around this catch-22?
It's a very, very challenging issue that you have just raised. Maybe the first point to make is that multilateral banks in general, as you know, the foundation of the business model has been lending to the sovereign, right? So the governments, the highly rated governments lend their AAA sort of rating to an MDB, and MDB has a high credit rating, so it has low cost of capital. It then uses that ability to raise money in the capital markets and provide the funding to developing world at a preferential interest rates. That is to the sovereign. Over time now, there's a much bigger focus on non-sovereign. IaDB, for example, in China, started out with a 30% focus on non-sovereign, 70% sovereign. That is now moved to 50% sovereign, 50% non-sovereign. New Development Bank has a 70% focus on sovereign, 30% non-sovereign. The direction of travel of all MDBs is towards lending more to the private sector. Why? Because there are certain areas of infrastructure and sustainable infrastructure where the private sector now are leaders in this space and can, for example, in renewable energy, whether it's solar, whether it is wind power, whether it's battery energy storage, in digital infrastructure, the private sector playing a significant role. So the two leading institutions globally, I would argue, in this space is obviously IFC, the International Finance Corporation, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, because they have really been anchored around private sector operations. And I think more and more MDBs will move away from lending to the sovereigns because of the fiscal distress that governments are facing, and the bigger focus, as I said, on mobilization of private sector finance. So creation of special climate funds is, for example, now one of the biggest priorities of banks like ourselves. Already, most of the MDBs, by the way, have targets. In our case, we have a 40% target of climate finance from this year. So almost half of our activities are focused on climate. EBRD is already at 50%, European Investment Bank already at 50%. So MDBs are moving away from their traditional business model in a very radical way, and doing what I touched on earlier on, to play the more catalytic role to mobilize your big institutional investor funds, your Mundis, your PIMCOs, your BlackRocks, and so on.
Thank you. Fazia, what's your IDB perspective on sovereign, non-sovereign? What trends are you seeing?
Yes, thank you. As I was mentioning before while introducing, the IDB group, indeed, by design, our public sector window is institutional coordinated with the private sector one. So we have IDB, which lends to sovereign governments, and IDB Invest, which is our private sector arm. So there is no doubt, and the numbers that were just mentioned coincide more or less, because if you take last year, I mentioned these over 20 billions we did in lending. Of these 20 billion, around 12 billion, 14 billion were on the public sector side, and the rest was for the private sector side in terms of volume. Now, focusing on climate finance, we all agree that long-term climate actions implementation, yes, requires coordination at all levels. So by design, it's a coordination that includes public and private sector actors. So this is the way we tackle all of our dialogue and design of operations in this area. And just to give you a very easy example, our participation at COP27, we see it as a group participation, and all events for us are public-private ones. And in the dialogue with countries in this direction, there is an alignment in terms of handling this matter in a coordinated way.
Vivienne, does that answer your question?
Yes, but I'd like to raise one question. It's the public enterprises, because public enterprises, public businesses, banks are being treated like governments. And we have different rating, we have different, we have our cash flows, we have our balance sheets. So with some multilaterals, with some international agencies like AFD, CAF, European Investment Bank, we could do no sovereign, but some institutions like the IDB and sometimes NDB and sometimes World Bank always, they look at us as government.
Yeah.
So that's one thing, Fazia, that maybe you could look at and say, well, if you have banks, enterprises, they're not governments, and try to see and operate like others. KfWs, I think we were debating with KfW about this, and they were going to study how to approach. But IDB would be, I think, would have another level if it started looking at BNDES and other banks in Latin America as businesses.
Yeah. That's an interesting idea. Let me come to the Amazon Fund and then come back to you, Claudia, on this point if I can. But that's because this is an interesting model with a public development bank.
Can I make some comments? I do not resist some comments on that.
But you have to finish 11:40 because we have Shri, and Shri is in India, and he
I'll
has
try to make it very fast. The road is short on carbon, and this is a message for the stable. Food, energy, and forest are the new order, worldwide order, and this is Brazil, Africa, and Indonesia. This is South-South coalition, and in doing so, this is the new strategic framework to drive our actions. And in that regard, actually 50% of all credit lines outsourced by BNDES today is already, that's at least one social environmental indicator. Otherwise, we cannot outsource the credit. And by the end of next year, any move that we're gonna do, we need to also to include the inventory of the carbon we are extracting or we are sequestrating from the atmosphere. So every little thing we do on the credit side, we're gonna consider this mechanism and this KPI. So it's very important. So coming back to the talk a lot about it, but about the climate fund, which is a very specific line provided by government. The idea is to use this climate fund, which has some implicit subsidies on this line. We're going to use this as a blended finance strategy in order to leverage the potential of the reach of this climate fund. And about the Amazon fund, what I can say is that Germany and Norway already announced that they're gonna be back with the funding of this thing, and BNDES is ready to operate. No problem, we're gonna operate this thing. But again, food, energy, and forest. This is a new world order, and we have to do this South-South alliance in order to play this game in a different scale.
Lucilla, I wonder if you have any insights from your paper on this Amazon fund.
Is that yeah.
I'm trying to turn on my video, but it's not appearing. Yeah, we have a working paper coming up today. It's going to be published later today, so I can send it to you guys afterwards. But I guess the focus of our recommendations is, how do we make the resources from the fund be more efficiently linked to what Bruno was saying? So deforestation is a big deal in Brazil. We need to, turn it down a lot to reach our NDCs, and perhaps also making our fund more resistant to changes in the political choices that sometimes, happen. So the focus is on this, on how we make it more efficient and also more resistant, more robust to the changes that eventually happen.
It's fascinating to think through all the different models that will be needed on the various aspects here that really stretch the institutional models different ways. Thank you, Lucilla. Claudia, you wanted to comment on this question.
Yeah, very briefly, because frankly speaking, I think that the Amazon Fund is one of the most robust models we have done in the past. But still, if there is no political will, it won't work. And I'm very positive that, and I'm very hopeful that with the political changes in Brazil, it can pick up again. And I think what people forget a little bit is that even in the past 4 years, 5 years, where Amazon Fund was not expanding or growing like intended before, on the subnational level, in many states, we continued with the same models and they work. I think the models and how to do it are there. And I mean, BNDES is doing a tremendous job also in reaching the final beneficiaries. But at the end of the day, definitely you need a political will. And no donors and no banks, no NDBs can substitute this if this is not there. But I'm confident that it's on the right direction.
Thanks, Claudia. I saw you comment from Bruno.
Yes, he has 1 minute because we have really to get up.
On Claudia's point, what's BNDES? By the way, BNDES means a National Development Bank of Sustainability Development. We're going to change the name, by the way, this year. And BNDES has 140 billion of BRL net worth, which is around 25 billion US dollars, right? 25 US billion dollars. We divest large public equity portfolio. Nothing in order to allocate this in the Amazon. So the thing is, it's very important to have a sort of a bundle of funding lines and structures, but frankly speaking, it's pretty much about capital allocation. We should allocate in the Amazon, whatever, 10%, 20% of the capital of the bank and protect, avoid deforestation. Amazon has 500 million hectares of forest. 500 million hectares. Let's allocate 15, 20%, 25% of the capital of the bank. Focus on that, because this is the key pillar of the strategic framework. Food, energy, and forest. This is a thing. We have funding to make it. It's a political will, and of course, structure, or model, governance, whatever, but frankly, it's not related to funding.
I love ending on an ambitious vision for what the future might be, and that's a really, really inspiring one. Thank you all for the comments. I know we're under time pressure, but I know the conversation will continue. So look forward to carrying on in COP27 or beyond. Yeah, see you.
Now, I just want to thank everyone for joining us. It has been a great moment to exchange, to learn. I've written a lot of things, and I know you are in different time zones too. So thank you, and a big clap for everyone who participated. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Fazia, for joining us from online, and hope to see you soon. So we have our next panel is with. Can you just?
Thank you.
You're welcome to stay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So we're jumping into our third and last panel on social impact. We've had it up to now on last mile development banks and partnerships, how to improve it, what are the challenges, and now we just finished another brilliant panel about climate change and We have participants from KfW, IaDB, BNDES, BNDES, and New Development Bank, and now we're jumping into a third one, and I just will pass the word here to our moderator, Anna Patrick. She is faculty from Oxford, from the Lankes School of Government. She's associate professor. She's been responsible, one of the responsible with Tom Hale for the COVID tracker, which is a great project. And also she's director of the Lund program I am affiliated to, so she's technically my boss. I'm very grateful to have this boss.
Weirdest thing to hear from someone I consider a mentor.
The floor is yours.
Okay, well, as you can see, Tom and I are at this stage of, well, COVID, we're a natural tag team. So I'm also actually a gender scholar. I did my PhD on gender representation. So I am so happy to see this panel. I have to say that. We have amazing speakers. Thank you all for joining online. Thank you everyone in the room. This panel really couldn't be more because at this juncture, coming out of COVID, inflationary pressures, growth concerns, it is, from all of our indications about social impact, a really difficult time to be someone who is generally in society finds it hard to make their way.
They get your image and they
I've got
listen you
floppy
better.
hair. I should have sorted that out today.
So they can hear better.
So this is a really important panel. What Nairi described yesterday about the purposes of development banks, to do development where the private sector thinks it's too risky, to do counter-cyclical policies. Now is when it really counts to step up. So I'm hoping that, the stakes are high, so I'm hoping for a really rich discussion today. Have you all introduced each other, or should I go through the panels?
Yeah, panelists, yes.
So we have Vivienne Apopo from yesterday, who I'm so glad you're here. As you all know, she's Director General of the East African Development Bank. We have Hans-Peter Lex. Do you want to wave online? Thank you very much for coming. From the ODI, formerly of the International Finance Corporation and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Thank you for joining us. I think online as well, is that right?
The other two guests.
Okay, the other two guests. I will mainly talk this way then. So we have Shri Sivasubramanian joining us, I think, from India.
From India.
He is Chairman and Managing Director for Small Industries of the Development Bank of India. Thank you for coming.
Just a small technical point. The word Shri actually is a salutation, and it's Mr. So you'll find every name in India, a male in India will have Shri written before it. So the name is actually Sivasubramanian, Ramann. And I know it's a very long name, so Ramann would do very well for the rest.
Wow, I feel like we've started by learning a lot already. I once started a panel about gender, and I was told something different about Mr. and Mrs. from people from Kiribati. And Mrs. is a word for smooth wave, and Mr. is a word for choppy wave. So I'm learning all the time. And definitely not least, last in the introductions only, Merita Blat, who is head of the mission on gender equality for the AFD. So thank you very much for joining us as well. So let's start off by giving you all a chance to say what you're doing in this area, because one of the things that comes through in the statistics is that more and more proportionally of the funds that development banks are giving are being given in a way that has a gender lens applied. So I thought we should start off by giving you an opportunity to explain what that substantively means for your institutions. And if I may ask you to also tell us a little bit about how you've learned to do that better over time. Because this is an area where there's a lot of learning over time, and I think the world started off thinking very descriptively about gender, and is now thinking far more substantively about gender, about the processes that have held people of some genders back over time. So,
Shri.
Ramann, please go first. I hear that you're under time pressure, so please go first.
Yes, and thank you so much for inviting me here. A special thanks to Leni Lemos. I think we've been in communication for a while, and thanks so much for including me in this session. So let me immediately start off by saying that given the socio-economic background and the last 60 or 70 years that India has been independent, there has been a focus on the MSME sector. Now, within the MSME sector, there really wasn't a differentiation between the gender. But somewhere in the early 2000s, an amazing movement got started, and SIDBI was actually a pioneer in that movement, which is really the concept of microfinance institutions. So as you would all know, the reach of a traditional bank is extremely limited. So even in India, I would say, though these are figures which are only partially counted, the microfinance sector deals with about 5% of the total loans given out in the country. So I'm saying that is really what's counted. What is further not counted is what the unorganized sector continues to lend. And this is actually happening more in the sort of tier 5, 6 towns and then the villages. So there's still a very large percentage of the population that stays in the villages. And for them, their normal practice is to run a small business as well as tend to agriculture. So that is really a very large percentage of the population. In fact, we still haven't been able to reach out to them, but what has happened is the microfinance institutions understood the model of lending to the women and thereby lending to the family. And this developed over 15 years. And today we're really talking about something in the region of, let me convert it now, 50 million plus women have been given finance through what is known in India popularly as the MFI movement or the microfinance institution movement. And this is about lending at their houses, collecting from their houses, and keeping an eye on what is it that they are using that money for, in what sort of business. And the beauty or the secret of this model is really the ability to get them to work as a group. So they're actually called self-help groups. It's probably there in other countries too. But the self-help group causes an internal peer pressure amongst the members of the self-help group, or it could be a joint liability group, whereby one member doesn't really stand guarantee, but sort of commits that as a group they would end up repaying what is expected to be repaid on a monthly basis. So this has been India's sort of great experiment and a successful experiment in financial inclusion. And therefore in India, the rural women are actually running their households far more effectively than probably a woman is doing in an urban area. And now we are seeing the movement for these very self-help groups and joint liability groups where they want to break away from the group because they've now got the confidence to be able to go out and take a loan in their own name. Now that's again happening largely within a family structure. So typically both husband and wife would tend to the agriculture as well as the business. But the businesses are now growing. So it could be, sort of small skills that are getting converted into, handicrafts, artisanship, etc. But this is a movement that we've seen growing over a period of time. And today the loans are actually getting directed to individuals. on top of which, because of the digitalization that has happened in the country, so a lot, I mean, you might have read about it, but effectively the payment system in India is nearly entirely digital. There is, of course, still a lot of cash being used, but what's happening is that even very small businesses manage to collect money based on what is known as a QR code. So they put a QR code outside their shop, and using that QR code, people are making money payments from a mobile phone. This has gone into about 76% of the country. So a lot of these small businesses are therefore creating what is known as a digital footprint, which then allows for bank account data to be picked up through digital means. So, you know, it's a very big sort of subject, but I'm trying to paraphrase it as much as possible. But the fact that digital means of payments have led to bank accounts holding or having an audit trail of payments being received by a small business, this allows for a lender to have a history of regular payments in a particular account, and therefore a cash-based lending system has developed. So, you know, we're really talking about the micro and the nano spectrum of the MSME businesses. At the other end of the spectrum, of course, the lending is easy to get. Once again, a lot of improved lending is happening on the back of a digital platform created by the government, which is holding all the GST invoices. So the GST invoices have led lenders to pick up those GST invoices and get a much better monitoring system as well as a credit appraisal system going. So that's really at the upper end of the MSME bracket, as we could call it. And that's a very wide bracket in India. But what's really more interesting is what I explained is the movements that are happening at the lower end of the spectrum. Now, on top of that, if we were to look at sustainability, then we're really talking about several factors that are now, you know, sort of imposing themselves upon these small businesses. So, you know, when in India, we're talking about movement from using outdated machinery to modern machinery. Now, that can happen even for very small businesses. There's an energy efficiency in that, which we're saying is really an addition to you know, their contribution to reducing their carbon footprint. So that's really the way we're looking at it, and that's the awareness that we're now creating. So what SIDBI is really trying to do as a development bank and as a DFI within the country, which looks at the MSME sector, we're trying to create this huge awareness campaign across the country where we're trying to address the fact that people should be moving from inefficient energy guzzling machines or even light bulbs and get them to move to more energy efficient ways of running their small business. So this is a huge program. We're running both lending programs as well as guarantee programs and partial risk sharing facilities. A lot of multilateral agencies are joining hands with SIDBI in this process. We've been running something with the World Bank for about 6 years. AFD and KFW are people who we're talking to. So, you know, from looking at the small business in terms of lending to now graduating them towards an ESG framework, I think that's really where I see the future going. But I think I'll stop there and not make it a monologue. Thank you.
I think the room is muted.
We can't hear you.
Is this better?
Yeah, that's good.
See, Fred rushes in and trusts the lecturers and the professors to do this for ourselves. COVID experience. Okay, so thank you very much for your comments, and I understand that you do need to leave. I think there's lots of issues to pick up there. Digital, obviously. You mentioned some of the structural challenges that come up when you try and include women. Women-owned and managed businesses are often biased towards the lowest score, and they are also tiny. And even if you just look at European data for women managers, you'll see that the bigger the business, the smaller the proportion of female managers, and an almost perfect correlation, apart from the giant businesses who are worried about, I guess, how that looks to not have many women around. And confidence. I was really interested in the way that you frame that, the confidence to take a loan. And we know there was actually a very recent study about how the more corrupt a society is and the stronger traditional gender stereotypes, the less likely women are even to apply for microfinance, because they worry that accountability will play out through informal accountability mechanisms, sanctioning socially, that will hit women harder than it will men for any particular ethical transgression. So, a lot to talk about. I'm going to move on and put the same original question to Hans. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing in terms of applying a gender lens and what the learning that has happened over time.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. First, just an observation. It was great to listen to Ramann. I think this is super interesting. India is probably the place where the largest scale experiments are happening when it comes to lending. And it has this advantage of having a history of group lending, the chits, and it can build on that, and sort of a way of getting around collateral constraints, which is sort of one of the big hurdles that you find in SME and especially in gender-based lending elsewhere. So that was really interesting to hear. Just briefly on sort of for background, I was with the IFC as a vice president until last year, and before that in the management of the EBRD. For IFC, SME lending and lending to gender is a major part of our strategy of the business. About 1/6 of IFC's portfolio. By the time I left, it was an outstanding SME finance portfolio of around $10 billion. And $1.5 to $2 billion of that was under the Banking on Women initiative. I don't have the latest numbers, but it must be around there. And we did an estimate at the time that the partner financial institutions that IFC was lending to or engaging with for SME lending had provided around $400 billion worth in loans to some 10 million microfirms and SMEs in IFC's countries of operation. So clearly financial inclusion is an important focus for IFC as it is for EBRD as well. And that's of course because access to finance is foundational for the twin goals of the World Bank Group and many of the SDGs. But as we know, there are large gaps because of operational and ecosystem barriers. In some cases, such as women's access to finance, there has been backsliding over the last few years. And I don't have the latest figures sort of post-COVID, but I would suspect that the backsliding continued. The barriers that we have and that explain this, they have history. And traditionally, banking and financial services have not been geared to financial inclusion. In terms of financial institutions, you have high cost structures that make it hard for them to engage with smaller businesses. You have reliance on very traditional forms of identification, collateral, and documentation. And we heard from Ramann ways of getting around that. And then you have business models that don't really meet the needs of smaller consumers. And then you have sort of ecosystem barriers, regulatory barriers for lending to higher risk. For instance, if you take Basel, Basel makes it quite expensive for financial institutions to lend to smaller businesses. And you have weak credit and information systems, and we know about that. So that leads us to the finance gap. And here, I saw Lini had been providing some information in the flyer for this event on the IFC estimate of the SME finance gap, and it's very large, as we know. But let me be a little bit self-critical here on behalf of IFC, EBRD, but also most development finance institutions. There's 2 points to bear in mind. One is that financial inclusion from the perspective of an excluded individual or a budding small business covers a range of things. It covers payments facilities, short and long-term credit, trade and supplier finance, equity, high-risk funds, insurance, leasing, savings products, etc. There is an excessive focus traditionally on just some segments of this. And secondly, that it's important to understand that the finance gap is a relative and a static concept, and we need to convert that into a strategic concept. And for that, this gap depends on the objectives that we're after. Is the objective financial inclusion and the empowerment of citizens, or is it the creation of jobs and of growth? And when we look at productive credit, is the objective preserving or is it growing the SMEs? Or is it actually promoting economic innovation and competitiveness? All of these are possible. And when we talk about smaller businesses, gender businesses, etc., all these objectives are there. But a strategy of simply plugging an aggregate finance gap is just not enough. The risk is that we end up not meeting the most important needs, and that we will be primarily preserving low productivity, low wage firms, and end up displacing more dynamic firms. Now, this is all generally understood. We've had many independent evaluations of SME support, including by IEG and the World Bank Group, and I remember the European Commission did significant work in this for lending in Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean neighborhood. So we know about this, but by and large, there's an inertia in terms of the instruments and a somewhat unquestioned attitude in the development finance institutions that lending to SMEs gives us brownie points irrespective of how we do it. Now, microfinance, which we heard about, to address financial inclusion at the bottom of the pyramid, that's absolutely impactful, though sometimes there's market saturation. So in a market like Mongolia, for instance, there's a kind of already too much of it, and there are several others, Southeastern Europe and some other places. And there's a mix-up of goals. There have by now been quite a few studies of randomized trials that show that despite individual success stories of microfinance for growth or for jobs, it's mostly about consumption smoothing. It's mostly about absorbing income volatility. Then you have the intermediated credit lines, and those are the mainstay of MDB SME finance, but they have a mixed record when it comes to their impact, because they are indiscriminate and they simply channel MDB risk, and that's especially true for sovereign MDBs that provide apex lines to state institutions for on-lending with no risk for the intermediary and therefore no incentive to identify higher performing SMEs. Those subsidies have often ended up undermining local market growth. And the results have been mixed evaluations. There's very little correlation between SME lending, SME finance, and jobs and growth, virtually anywhere in the world. There has been very significant exposure to FX, foreign exchange risks, for SMEs, which then come through in stress situations. There's been inefficient use of capital, both of the MDBs and of local banks, because they originate to hold instead of offloading these risks. And there has been very little dynamic market development because these tools don't address the source of the problem. I'm gonna leave it there, and we can come back to sort of the forward-looking strategy.
So thank you. A lot of food for thought. There's some very pressing questions, and I'm gonna guess that given that Vivienne yesterday talked about the efforts of the East African Development Bank to lend to SMEs, that you're probably quite desperate to come in on some of these points. I'm sort of feeling it across the table, but so please do respond to any of those points, but also tell us a lot more about what applying a gender lens means in your bank.
Thank you, and thank you once again for the opportunity to participate in these very, very important discussions. With regard to SMEs, the East African Development Bank, in its strategy, I think about 15 years ago, it decided that we needed to support this sector because it is absolutely critical for job creation, but also for developing the future large businesses that would then support the economy. So we needed to grow enterprises from the ground up rather than as normal development banks would do, waiting for the larger corporates or the larger private sectors to finance. So we are financing development of the corporate sector from ground up. And and we took this from our experience over the years. We are 55 years old. That a large number of SMEs that were financed in the 70s and 80s have now become the regional, blue chips that are really supporting the economy and paying taxes and employing a lot of people. So the SME financing for us is not sort of a CSR or something to do as a byproduct of what we always do. We decided to focus on SMEs. And we also looked at the funding that was available in the region, and we realized that there was quite a number of MDBs, both regional and international, that are already providing financing for bigger projects. But there was hardly any MDB providing funding to the SME sector. Now, there's a lot of discussion about this funding to the micro sector, microfinance institutions. There are very many of them. I think there's even been reference to there being too many of them, and that is true. But when we analyze them further, we realize that we might not be able to achieve the objective because the microfinance institutions would approach the microfinance businesses through a very sort of risk-averse lens, including the commercial banks. So those microfinance institutions would provide credit at very, very high rates of interest and other, fairly stiff conditions, which almost predisposed micro businesses to fail. Because if you're coming in and you're a small business, you've got a very good idea, but your interest rate is multiples of what another corporate would get, then the likelihood of success is very low. And that also affected the women, because the women would be typically coming in with either capital goods for collateral. They don't have land. So it would either be an equipment that they have, their car. And obviously, when you price that in the risk matrix, the interest rates become very high. So we decided to turn this around and say we're going to treat micro, small and medium enterprises the way we would treat a sovereign. So the way we rate a sovereign and the way we rate a large corporate, we're going to create a program and a framework that allows us to measure the risk of a small enterprise on its own metrics. So we're not going to come in with this or sort of predisposition towards risk. We're going to look at this business and say, really, what are your true credentials? What are your true metrics? And if we think your metrics are AAA, then we're going to give you credit that is priced at that level. So we were able to address that big challenge because a lot of the small businesses would come and say, look, I have this fantastic business, but my government is borrowing, say for Kenya, government is borrowing at 12% in local currency. Therefore, my borrowing rate is 18 or 19 or 20%. So what sort of business would you be doing at 20% that would make you viable, however good it is? Unless you're just buying goods and selling, you're buying finished products and selling, you're in retail. But if you are producing, you're manufacturing, you're growing, then you cannot really sustain that sort of interest rate. So we turned this around and brought down the interest rate to the lowest possible figure. We also look at the foreign exchange risk. A lot of the funding we are a largely dollar funding bank. And this is because we finance larger projects for imports of equipment, machinery, and etc. But again, our clients require the currencies that make sense to them and they can manage. So we develop a program for local currency funding. And because, as I said, the government funding also is quite expensive, we had to become very innovative and not benchmark on a government bond. So if government is funding at 12%, that still for us is a problem. That's government's problem. For our businesses, we create an internal treasury function that brings down, through treasury operations, the rate of interest. So we would be lending to our clients at, say, 5%, which is below government. Then, of course, the economists in the room will all cry, oh, you're creating market distortion, this is, underpricing. But we say if the market is already distorted, the role of a development bank is actually to cover that gap and to mitigate against market distortion. And our clients, being micro and small, are the least capable to shoulder these kind of market distortion. So we're not giving them concessional loans, and we don't consider them concessional loans. We consider them actually market-priced loans if the economy was functioning properly and the market was functioning properly. So we bring in our credit at a level that we think is sustainable. We're not doing it concessionally, we still have a return, but it is reasonable. The other aspect that we address for microfinance, most of them will tend to borrow short-term because of the way they are priced and analyzed. So the microcredit would be, the longest tenor would probably be 3 years, which again, you cannot do much if you're in agriculture with 3 years. So we extend our tenor to 5 to 7 years on a micro, small and medium loan at that price. Now, because we are a development bank and we don't have a branch network, we have to function and work through commercial banks that have the largest commercial banks that have the outreach, because we need to get this credit to our clients wherever they are, particularly the women, because for them, logistics and moving from wherever they are to the city to look for these loans really would not be practical. So we're working with banks that have very large branch networks. And what we say to them is that this is a line, it's not an EPEX funding that we're going to give to you to deploy in the manner that you'd like. This is a joint partnership. And we would want you to look at your client profile and see the small businesses, the micro businesses that are doing well and need support to expand. And that is the group that we want to pilot with you, because you already have a credit history with them, either they bank with you, they've borrowed with you small amounts, and they've been able to repay. So how can we work with you? You take the credit risk because they're your clients, but we provide you funding that is at a low cost, which enables you to put in your margin, but still get the beneficiary of the client to get the funds at a price that makes sense. So that means we would really give the financial intermediary enough room for maneuver to cover their losses, to cover their risk, but at the same time, attend to our clients. And we started this as a pilot in Uganda, which is our host country. And just looking at the numbers, this has grown over time. And so the portfolio is quite large. But as of June, we have about 6,000 loans on this program for Uganda. For Kenya, slightly lower, about 1,200. But that's a lot for an institution such as ourselves. This is just the current program, not the cumulative. The cumulative is quite large because some of these clients have already paid their loans and moved on to borrow elsewhere, or again, to borrow from the same institution that we participate with. So this is really for a niche window, micro, small, and those that want to expand, green fields that no commercial bank wants to touch. And once they're stabilized, then they can move on and borrow from the normal commercial banks. Now, for the women, the digital platforms have been very, very useful because for cultural reasons, social reasons, or even practical reasons, it may not be possible for a woman-led business or an owner of a business who has a family, she has children and other things to tend to be able actually to go to the bank and negotiate this loan and sign a lot of papers, come back. The bank may be 100 kilometers from where they live, depending, particularly in the rural area. So we find that being able to work with financial institutions that can dispense loans through a digital platform, the most famous in our region is M-Pesa. They can actually put money on the phone. The client will first fill a credit reference form, and of course it's tied to a credit reference bureau. And once they go through basic metrics, then the monies are disbursed to them on the phone, and they also repay on the phone. But this is very important, and our failure rate or loss rate is extremely low. I think we're at about 1.5 or 2% even during the COVID pandemic, because for many of these businesses, they realize that this is the lender of last resort, just like the sovereigns do. And so they do not want to jeopardize their credit history with the financial institution or with ourselves, because they know that the next time they want to expand their business, this is really their first port of call. And so we found that our success rate has been very, very high. And for the financial institutions who are quite reluctant in the first instance, are now coming back for more funding, but also others. We've been able to attract other financial institutions to come and partner with us in this program. We've also seen a number of MDBs reach out to us, because we started this with one or two MDBs, but now we have, I think, 3 MDBs that are asking us to work with them to be able to channel funds to this particular, business segment. And so all in all, I would say that the SME portfolio for us is one of our windows. We lend to government, we lend to the private sector, though we are more oriented to the private sector. I would say we are 95% private sector, just 5% sovereign. But out of our private sector window, the SME portfolio for us is really the most innovative, but also is one that is most encouraging to us. And we're looking forward, obviously, to growing that particular window. Thank you.
Thank you for explaining that so well. And you answered the question that was on the tip of my tongue, and that was, what was the default rate?
Yes.
For pricing the risk very differently. And I think listening to you, what really makes the point is you're correcting for market failure. Mm-hmm. And if you do that well, then this is market expanding, right? It's good for the economy. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to turn now to Merita Blat as our sort of our gender specialist to talk about innovation in the field. So what's your experience, and what's the learning been from your perspective?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I have shared a presentation. Let me just try if I can directly put it in the screen, and if not, I will kindly ask for help from the technical leads. Let me see if it works. So do you see it?
Yes. Yes.
Is it do you see it in a full screen?
No.
No. Okay, so it's not working.
Presentation switch between.
Okay, maybe like that it will be working.
Perfect.
Okay, excellent. Thanks a lot. So thanks a lot again for the invitation. I just wanted to very briefly do a quick presentation on 2 main axes on the subject that was suggested, and maybe answering the first question on what are the issues and challenges, and seeing with more detail what are the projects in this area are doing in the field. So about the first axis, about issues and challenges, without the idea of making any gender equality course, I just wanted to briefly remind, and that was shared by the previous speakers. Hans was telling about the different areas that are covered when you're working on gender equality and women economic empowerment. Of course, everything that has to do with women economic empowerment is tightly linked with all the subjects that we are seeing in the screen. You are also working with gender-based violence. You're working with discrimination. You're working, and all of the subjects have been issued and raised by the previous speakers. So very briefly, the idea of working, of course, with economic opportunities and gender equalities, of course, to promote empowerment, leadership, access to resources, access to the global and collective leading, the importance of making sure that it's also linked to the workplace and the labor force. And it's important to bear in mind that we are working with different sustainable development goals and a close link to human rights, and of course that it has positive effects on better economic integration, both at the society, community, and family levels, of course. I wanted to just stop a few minutes, and I'm sorry, it moved to another slide. And I think what's at the core of our discussion when we make the presentation on how you work on gender equality in business, of course, you focus on the blue circle, the broader one, social representation and norms, taking into account the importance of unpaid care work, of leadership infrastructures that were also mentioned, the importance of the networks, the access to markets and products that are very tightly linked with what we are talking today. And then when you narrow down the circle, you go to the women economic empowerment issues on the employment, employability, education, trainings, technologies. Digital was also mentioned. And of course, you also tackle the question of legal framework, access to land, to ownership and rights. And at the same time, and that's essential in all the continents we are working with, is the question of informality and formalization issues that are very important. And then when you narrow down again, you go to women entrepreneurship and financial inclusion, and that's where you try at least to work to access to adequate financial and non-financial products and services, and business development networks and financial education. So the importance is to try to bear in mind all the three circles, because of course, this is one of the main questions, to see how and what you're tackling, but at the same time, when you're creating credit lines to development banks, so that's our case in IFD, it is important to bear in mind the three circles. I just wanted, before I present two of the projects we're working with, I wanted to remind the importance of the collective work on this issue. And at AFD, we're very committed on working in partnership with this gender equality theme. And we are very active in the IDFC, at the International Development Finance Club. We are co-leading this work with our colleagues from Turkey, the TSKB, and the Argentinian colleagues from BICE. And we have got some priority issues. One of the priority issues we are working with right now is trying to tackle gender finance mapping and trying to oversee, because there is no finance mapping right now that is collectively assumed by all the different leaders. Of course, we do use the DAC gender equality mechanism, but this is not shared by all the development banks in the field. And it seems very important to see what we are funding and how we define gender finance mapping. So this is one of our priority actions in IDFC. And I also wanted to mention the work that has been done in the previous years by the Finance in Common movement. There is also a gender equality working group that is now led by the African Development Bank and UN Women. AFD started this work and group, and we have just received the confirmation that there are new signatories of the gender equality statement, which is a very important asset for development banks working on gender equality and more specifically on finance for gender equality. So if we move to what AFD is working and doing in this field, I just wanted to very briefly resume our work with the importance of a peer-to-peer dialogue that for us is essential in order to understand how the development bank we are going to what is we're trying to see an importance of creating a credit line. So how the development bank is working on this gender perspective, both in the operations and the human rights policies. It's also important to see what will be the capacity building of the expertise and support internally inside the development bank in order to try to obtain these transformative changes. And we have two opportunities that could be combined on working on credit lines with very complementary approaches. The first one is the mainstreaming of a gender approach, as I was mentioning, both in human rights or in the operations or in the credit lines in itself, so in the portfolio. The importance at the same time, of course, of developing any gender action plan and, if needed, a technical assistance program. And the second path is to develop a dedicated either financial and non-financial products with services and mechanisms that could be in different fields. Of course, there is the classic women entrepreneurship development program, but it's also possible to develop any other questions and items. We are right now, for instance, working on development of gender and climate, also credit lines, so to spot on and try to focus on this development of entrepreneurship on both gender and climate. And there are some other new areas that are at the study right now. I will move to the presentation of the projects. I wanted to very briefly present our loan that was landed to Egypt to the Micro, Small and Medium Enterprise Development Agency, so a state company that is developing women SMEs. So the idea of this loan that was as well that had a technical assistance program was to encourage the creation of women-owned enterprises by the creation of access to financial and non-financial resources, and at the same time making sure that by this support the idea was to promote the women entrepreneurship and job creation. And the second project I wanted to present is a loan that is under a third revision right now to the TESCABE, to our TESCABE partner in Turkey. Which is a loan that previously was very focused on the development of women entrepreneurship, and now in this current revision is more focused on women equality in the workplace. So by that, it's what TESCABE has done, and we are very proud of it, is the creation of a gender equality toolkit that is applied to any loan that has that is linked to this credit, and that allows the importance of a self-assessment for each company on gender equality, the importance of the analysis of the eligibility of companies to the AFD fund, and as well to identify and design gender action plans inside the companies that are funded by this loan. So important to keep in mind that is a broad spectrum of possibilities to work on this issue, and of course we are trying to learn little by little how to improve on that matter. Thanks a lot for that.
Thank you, and thank you for concrete examples, because so many times when I talk about gender and finance, it gets very kind of I don't want to say waffly, but it's like there's something that people find hard when you use words like intersectionality to make concrete, right? So yes. Thank you for those concrete examples. I am slightly aware of time, but I do want to draw in questions from the room in person and online. Does anybody have any questions for our panelists? Or panelists to each other, I might have as well.
I think you could hear a bit more of Hans. He said, I'm going to jump into this strategy, and then he retreated. So he can just complete that small strand.
I think, Hans, you brought up some very pressing issues about where the priorities are. So I'd like to hear you extend on some of those ideas as well.
Thank you. Thanks. That's great. And it's just tremendously interesting to listen to the other panelists. So I think what Mar has told us is really an absolutely solid gender-focused program. Which one thing what we notice with NDBs and other DFIs is how little they learn from each other. And it's sort of one of the big mysteries over my 3 decades with MDBs, that there's a lot that's going on out there, and there are very positive developments, and it's very hard to get them, into these institutions. For instance, what Vivienne was telling us about the innovations that they have, financial innovations. East Africa is absolutely leading in these issues, and this is stuff that needs to be done, in Latin America, needs to be brought elsewhere by institutions working there. So that's kind of my number one strategy is learn from what's out there. And there is, especially over the last decade or so, there has been a huge amount of development, especially technology-enabled development that one can build on. Right? So my main point for the MDBs is learn, and it's to be more innovative, and it's to take more risks. So I find some of the MDB portfolios in the financial sector almost obscenely risk-free. Okay, so I don't want to name institutions, but I know two that have NPL ratios in financial, sector lending of less than 1%, and that is through some major crises. That means that they're just not taking risks. And if we want to get into sector, what's the value added of these institutions, and how are we going to promote sectors that are considered to be risky by the market? Well, we have to take risks. So one thing for the NDBs, for the DFIs, is to go out there and take more risks. The other thing is they have to widen their toolkit based on learning. Most of them have the capability to do so. If not, they can and they should build it. You have to move from plain vanilla credit lines, which still dominate in terms of the numbers, as I said. You have to move to fintech. You have to move to insurance and leasing. You have to move to structured finance solutions. You have to move to local currency solutions. What Vivienne said is so important. Guarantees are totally underutilized. The power of the guarantee to distribution of risks rather than to booking to hold, and to using incentives rather than subsidies. And I'll give you a couple of examples on that. But so market development incentives to address the needs of specific segments, women, of farmers, of regions. And there's a lot that's going on in the real world, and the MDBs there, in my view, have to catch up, right? So for instance, Africa has led on digital payment services, and that's brilliant because the phone contract substitutes for collateral. And collateral, as we said earlier, is one of the big obstacles to, especially to gender lending. Also an example with AXA and some other insurers, we have this great program called She for Shield, gender-based insurance. In Africa, the women's health insurance sector, for instance, is totally underdeveloped. Why? It turns out that all the insurance agents are men. So you send these men around, and literally, I'm saying 100% of AXA's sales force in Nigeria were men. Okay, so they go out there. They're never going to see the women. These are societies in which that's not going to happen. But the women are actually the most important, the most interesting market for health insurers. So just simply by changing your sales technology, you can achieve a lot. And there again, I think Africa, there's a lot that you can learn. You can learn a lot from bKash, payment services, Bangladesh. They went to like 30 million customers within no time. And those are technology-enabled payment services. Asia has been leading on AI, on artificial intelligence-based microbanking solutions. And financial is just a tremendous example. I think 400 million customers, and that's gender blind because it's based on behavior patterns that their algorithm manages to analyze and extract. And women actually come out quite well when it comes to financial behavior patterns. And so that is incredibly powerful. We have other great examples. Confio in Mexico, for instance, has done something very similar. There is, on the insurance side, you have CoverFox in India, which is a great example, which drives insurance penetration for SMEs and with a strong focus. Every time you have these technology-enabled solutions, you get a much better way of reaching women than you do with the traditional means. And Latin America has been absolutely top when it comes to capital market-based solutions, social and gender bonds. There's been a lot of innovation in Brazil and in Colombia, in other countries, and that can be brought. IDB Lab has been great in supporting the technology-enabled financial inclusion solutions. And those are all instruments that need to be applied. There are great examples now. They need to be taken over and driven in other contexts and scaled up. So for me, the pillars of the finance strategy for social impact are: we need an intermediation for scaling up finance, but the local banks, they will need technical assistance to move away from collateral-based lending, and they have to have skin in the game. Otherwise, we get sort of in a way a dumb distribution of credit. And there are good examples, but I'm taking too much time here. There are performance-based approaches to intermediation for gender objectives. The most powerful instrument we had at the IFC was something that was started by Goldman Sachs. It's this Banking on Loan program, where there is a little incentive for the intermediary bank, which ends up empowering local branches, essentially, who lend to this segment. And we had a mobilization ratio of 57. There's nothing like it in blended finance otherwise. We have studies again on gender objectives on the equity side. We did a study with Rock Creek and Oliver Wyman on the performance of equity funds, depending on women's representation in their management. And it turns out that equity funds with a balanced representation outperform the rest of the equity funds by about 1 percentage point of returns per year. And that was looking at 700 private equity funds, the largest study of its type done in emerging markets. We then adopted the strategy that we would be forcing all the equity funds that IFC was investing in to put forward a plan for increasing, showing a more, building a more balanced gender management base. I think I'm taking too much time, but they're great examples on the next slide, which needs to be part of this for reach. There's VC, venture capital for innovation, and there are practical solutions for that in Africa and South Asia, which are really abound, especially linked to solar home systems and a variety of other things. And then we have to build capital markets, and that's possible. It's even possible in very low development capital. In Côte d'Ivoire, 2 years ago, we did a securitization of SME loans of $67 million with the NSIA, Banque Côte d'Ivoire. And that provides local currency, and it takes risks off the books of these banks so that they can go on lending to the segment. So I'm sorry, I'm probably a little bit.
These are all fantastic examples for all of us to learn from. And I think there's 2 points that I just want to pick up on, and it's part of the many, many helpful points that you made. One is that we should do this again. Like, clearly, there isn't enough learning from each other. Yanni, please come back. And we should do this quite regularly. And also, I think a bit of congratulations to people in the room who are really innovating in this area. So well done, and well done, and well done. Just before we close, I do want to turn to Vivienne and Mar to talk a little bit about some of the things that they think need to be pursued in the future. Just what are the 1 or 2 things that are most important to you? Let's go to Vivienne first.
I think for me, the most important thing is pricing. I think it's a sore point. Pricing at the MDB level, but also pricing for small and medium scale businesses, because across the board, the general price that these businesses are able to attract in terms of interest rates are fairly high, higher than sort of mainstream corporates, and yet they need this funding to be able to grow. So if we're going to grow businesses, we therefore must find a way of ensuring that the funding they get is affordable, not free, but affordable, makes sense to them, and has the right tenor so that the businesses can grow. So for me, I think that is our biggest challenge, and that's what we consistently spend our time working on, just getting the funding price right. The NPLs, in our view, are a derivative of high pricing. So if you're going to price high, likely the business is going to stumble. And that is going to be more apparent in the next 1-2 years. The interest rates generally are rising, and there's all talk of recession. And so we are keen to ensure that we support our businesses through these difficult times, to ensure that they also remain viable. They provide employment, but they also provide goods and services and other products which are very necessary for the economy. So I think that for me would be my 2 very critical to-dos in the next 46 months or so. Yeah.
Brilliant. I'm going to turn online now. Tell us about what your 1 or 2 most important things are going forward.
Well, for me, the maybe the two most important things. The first one is the mapping of gender finance that I was talking before. We do have a question of how we identify gender equality projects, and of course how we identify among the different development banks a methodology that could be used in all kind of countries. So this is first, as the climate change has done it as well on financing. It's important to make sure that we all identify the same possibility of counting. And then the second main point is making sure that we keep the transformative effect, because the idea is to attain gender equality. And we have plenty of ways of trying to innovate on this matter. Either we continue in the fact of developing SMEs as an access to entrepreneurship, but as well, there are many kinds of trying to focus either on a subject. I was mentioning, for instance, the link between gender and climate, which is an important focus for AFT, but there are many others that need to be explored, and it could be interesting to make sure that we keep this importance of gender transformative in mind. The idea is not just to, and of course it's important to fund women for their autonomy and their empowerment, but it's important to make sure that the linkage and the focus we keep is gender equality. So that would be the two main things.
And I can just tell you that I adore your slide with the different circles. I've been trying to write that in paragraphs for a chapter recently, and it was beautiful. Okay, so I'm just going to thank our fantastic panelists. I learned a huge amount, and I study gender, so I'm really appreciative of you coming today. And I'm serious, let's do this again. So thank you all very, very much. And I also want to say a very, very, very big thank you to Leanne, who we had meetings in a wine bar as our one-to-ones.
Yeah.
Because
I love them.
As much as she's a legal boss currently, she's very much a mentor to me. And I have adored spending time with you, and I think this meeting is absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
And also thank you to Leah and to the students who helped. Really appreciate it.
Big clap.
Okay, take care.
So can I just, I'd like to invite them just for our final remarks. If you have just 3 minutes for us, because then we have lunch. And I wish you a good lunch without us, which is going to be a shame, but maybe next time. So I just wanted to wrap up, adding to the words of honor, of gratitude to everyone who has worked at Blavatnik School. It looks very simple and quiet in kind of 2 days, 1.5 day event, but it took a huge effort. So in the name of Leah, who has doing huge amounts of work on her. I'd like to thank all the teams and everyone who has been working on this, because this has been great. But I just wanted to say that for me personally, this was a great experience and the opportunity to be here and learn so much. Yesterday in the high level panel, we were debating, and today at 9 a.m. we're just getting all those concepts back here just to remind us what was said yesterday. We were debating on good governance, how regulation can help to unlock climate change investments. We're talking about funding costs and how the burden of rating in some areas. We have talked about cooperation and platforms and partnerships and how they have helped to build good stories, but also how macroeconomic, political, and volatility has also created some challenges to especially to small and medium businesses. And today we had this very bright, brilliant morning in which we had last mile banks discussion, and then climate change, and now social impact with small businesses and gender. And it's really interesting because it has added up to yesterday conversation. So we have discussed how to crowd in investments, how markets are important so that we can build this, can fill this this financial gap. We talked about operational issues like foreign exchange risking. We have talked a lot about collaterals, a lot about the risking. We have talking, and that is really important, digitization, not only for the businesses, for the banks, but also as a tool for financial inclusion. We talk counter-cyclical, the role of development banks and the aftermath of COVID. And I'll talk a lot about future. We talked about the good stories, the flaws, but also what in the next decade we should be doing to feel to accomplish our mission. Because that's, I think, it's the main difference from development banks and development financial institutions from banks, the commercial multiple banks. We are driven by a mission. And we've been talking about these two things that development banks do about market failures, and talk about is a lot, and also about public goods. But our mission is what it takes us together in this ecosystem. So I thank you so much for joining us. I thank you so much for in the room, those who have worked, participated, and who are here in person too. And I do look forward for the next meeting now. A big applause for all of you. So bye-bye, guys. Good lunch.
Bon appetit.
Bye-bye.
Bye.